Ladies and gentlemen, I have a complete thrill today and honor to speak with Mr. Sartori, the one and only, and I'm so glad to have this chance to talk about his book on tents before temples with Mr. Michael Sartori, Rough Drafts on Building a Culture That Lasts. I really appreciate a book that tries to cover what we need to talk about as opposed to subjects that perhaps we don't need to talk about, not to be judgmental or anything, but
Mhm.
hey, one of the problems with the boomer generation is the only ethic is not to be judgmental, right? So, there
Yeah.
is something to be said about being discerning, but a book that's really trying to look at each of these major social, economic, generational issues, one by one by one, to think them through. I think that is extremely important work. I think thinking these topics is extremely important work. And I think thinking them in the context of Christianity is really important.
Mhm.
There has not sometimes, Michelle and I would say at Unoy, and we talked about this at Unoy, that there was a lot of emphasis on, say, culture wars, but not culture making. When if you make the culture, you win the war. You could win, you could win the war and not be able to make anything afterward, right? And so, what would
Yeah.
it matter? And so, it's really important to engage in culture making, and to think new systems, new institutions. But of course, the fun of Christianity is as there's a need to talk about building culture, there's also a skepticism of anything that is built because it has a tendency toward idolatry. Any institution that's made can be corrupted. So, what do we do? What do we do? Well, it's not self evident. Therefore, the importance of books and work that are thinking it deeply and clearly to do that work is really important because it is not obvious how to go about it easily. It takes careful consideration, and that is what Michael has given us. But the first question, Michael, and I'm happy to go anywhere in this discussion on this fine day out here in the garage because I love being in the garage. Tents before temples. Why'd you title it Tents Before Temples, Michael?
Well, it's kind of got a nice alliterative
It
quality.
does.
So,
Yeah, it does.
but so it comes obviously from like the Hebrew scripture and kind of a curious detail of there's God, God takes the Israelites out of Egypt, brings them into the desert, and then has them build this tent temple, the tabernacle, that is a temporary mobile structure before, there's a later temple built in the Holy Land. Um, and, it's just one of those things that when you think about um, the way that people talk about like the foundations of great culture or something like that, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but being that it's God, there must be a reason. So and that was kind of just kicking around my head for a while. And then it was actually, I don't remember exactly what the video was about. Somebody made a video, and I just ended up leaving a comment about it. It was something to do with I think it was Eric Weinstein or one of the Weinsteins talking about kind of the scientific consensus and the way that right, that everybody's so focused on putting all their eggs in the one basket of whatever the orthodox opinion is, and that there are maybe secondary hypotheses like and I think it was like if the modern um, conception of like how evolution works is going to fall apart, then well, if it actually collapses, we're going to default to something anyway. So why don't we invest some of our energy into whatever the second most plausible thing was? And then I was just thinking about that and leaving a comment and thinking like, if you kind of have this tent creation mechanism, I was thinking about this in the sense of like hypothesis, like that it's generating lots of hypotheses. Some of them you might fall apart rather quickly, but the fact that our scientific system says we all have to basically agree on one great hypothesis and like try it all, put everything in one basket at the same time, try that, invest so much is risky. It's also kind of doesn't really produce anything really innovative. Uh, you get people doing experiments on like really stupid variations of things that we already know instead of something groundbreaking. So that was kind of the thing. And then just from there, that the phrase of tents before temples kind of stuck with me. And then I kind of saw it as a very practical kind of principle that worked in a lot of things because it allows you to get to action before you have certainty, and that's kind of the thread that runs through the whole thing.
Mhm. I think that's very well said. It was interesting thinking about the title because I like the double play on the word before, because there's one way in which it's like, can you run a tent before a temple? And actually, there can be a way where humans want a temple to get out of the work of a tent, right? Because then it's sedentary. I don't have to think about it anymore. There's something that's kind of mobile and agile about the tent. And I think it's a very powerful image because Christianity obviously has this very interesting skepticism of political centralization. But how in the world do you have something hold together without something centralized to hold it together, right? Like, obviously, everyone in Israel wants a king, right? And it's like, are you sure? And it's like there's real skepticism of any sort of centralization of power that occurs, right? Um, at the same time, there's an idea that there's something about human beings that tend towards centralization. And so, is there a way to have tents before temples? Right? Something that you're training people into to kind of check and balance that centralization. Because there's a kind of vision as well that, I've spoken with Cadell about, and that's just interesting that by the time you get to the Holy Spirit, there's some sort of mysterious idea of the possibility of making a people in their diversity that, in a sense, have a shared orbit, but not necessarily a central temple, a central place. And yet there's one God, right? So it's interesting to think of there being one God, above all gods, that is worshipped. And yet that God is very skeptical of a temple, which, of course, as Vanderklay has talked about, that's very counter to all of the other surrounding religions, right? And I think reclaiming the idea of the tent, even versus the church building, right? Like, well, how different is it to gather at a tent versus at a church building, right? That's a kind of different mindset. And really, there's something, again, because I always think Christianity invites these pretty remarkable tensions. Could we use a church building? Can we relate with centralized federal power and maintain a tent mindset, right? And there's something also about Christianity that is constantly like asking you to do almost those impossible things. Because as we learn, like in sociology, if you use a building, it trains your habits. It trains how you think about the world. Like, our spaces make us and we make our spaces. Spaces are tools, right? And so they train us into more of a centralized, sedentary mindset in just using it. But theoretically, if you could maintain a relationship to it that was more like a tent, then perhaps you would be able to get the benefits of institutions without being trained into the overfitting negatives. So I just really love that phrase because it kind of brings out already at the beginning, for me, a serious tension of, I want to say, the political science of Christianity, that there is always a skepticism of centralization, and yet nevertheless a need for a church that brings people together. So what does it mean to bring people together without centralizing them, right? I mean, that starts orbiting a whole lot of tension. So I really appreciate that. But the first thing I wanted to say is, for anyone listening, the book can be found on Amazon. Go buy it. It is broken up into a number of sections. 6, we have tools. Part 2 is called wilderness. Part 3 is the Technotic School Project, which I am all about school projects. Part 4 is culture building. Part 5 is confrontation. Part 6 is celebration. And today we're going to be focusing on tools in wilderness, although the conversation, no doubt, will allude to many things all throughout it. The first thing I want to say, I also really appreciate how at the beginning, when you talk about the rough draft, the digital age has ushered in a new way of writing. Misspelled words are fixed with a click whenever the little red line appears beneath them. I really think this is pointing as well to just anyone listening to this. Books now, we need to see as contributions to the conversation to approach these issues. Like, to just kind of put the work out there to contribute to the discussion so that we actually all have something to orbit. I think there's actually kind of a Christian humility in the willingness to put yourself into something, put out, as you say, rough drafts on building. And that's a liberating phrase, because sometimes our nervousness to put stuff out means that we don't contribute to something to the conversation that's really, really important, that people need. And actually, too, I think, like we're seeing with the use of YouTube, and you described that, in what you were saying with Vanderklay and the TLC, this kind of not perfectly polished podcasts that you
Yeah.
see, that if you're willing to throw yourself in there, I think that's actually kind of contributing to this possibility of an orbit of tense, an orbit of a political project where there are people that are brought together, that are working together, but not necessarily the same as a top-down power structure. Obviously, there are forms of hierarchy that always forms, and there are inspirations, obviously in the TLC, people like a Peterson, a Peugeot, etc., right? Vervaeke, these have a big influence. But then also around that are kind of tense, right? And I guess I really appreciated reading the introduction, which was very well written, and enjoyable. And I love learning about your past in word working, which was really great. There's something about how what we're actually seeing online, I think metaphorically, does kind of make me think of tents. It makes me think of tents before temples, and how people are creating these places where we can gather under a tent. Which then I guess because I live in Lynchburg, I was thinking like big tent revivals as well,
Mm.
kind of the revivals that are going on. But I guess the first thing I would throw at you, just as a very open question, if there's anything you'd like to say on the preface or the introduction, or also just two reasons why you wrote the book or felt a need to write the book, or what things you encountered that kind of made you go, "Oh, I'm gonna write this," just as a kind of open question in that way to take it any way you like, Michael.
Sure. So the first idea of it, and the first part I really wrote, is the section that we probably won't get to so much today, but the tectonic school,
Mm,
which was kind of, it's kind of an idea for a reintegration of several things. So I had gone to a discipleship program instead of going to college, in a big mega church. It was like an internship. Had some good things about it, had some not so great things about it. Then I went to Bible college, learned some more things. Um, Eventually found out none of these things that I've paid money to study actually provide me with an income. Fortunately, I did learn some skills from my dad, and I had taught myself a few more. And so I lucked my way into a career working in carpentry and working with my hands. And I really enjoyed that. And, it was seeing, and especially when it came to, um, for a long time, it was like fantasy audiobooks and things like that, but then switched into like, a lot of the stuff I found on YouTube later on. But something to engage the mind while I'm working with my hands, while I'm using my body. It's paying the bills. I have a sense of satisfaction. I've actually completed a task. Problems are fixable. It teaches me that, uh, there are certain kind of unbreakable limits to reality. Like postmodernism doesn't really work so great on a job site. You kind of just have to deal with things that, it doesn't matter if it's not perfect, it's straight enough, it's good enough, So it was this very kind of practical thing that removed a lot of the anxiety of like the meaning crisis, I guess you could say, or something like that. And so then I saw, well, like, oh, well, actually, I got all these things from sort of these different places, but you could really easily kind of merge them all together if did it with intention. So, and I, thought involving a church to get more involved in markets, um, through, so you're more connected to the business world, through something like construction, teaching young people a trade. At the same time, you're having mentorship, which is discipleship, really. You have the opportunity to discuss things, you have the opportunity to learn things because you can listen while you're working. Um, and so, it creates a much more well-rounded, like even right now, you can do if you do these things, and if this is, that you've mentioned you've done sort of similar things, you kind of can craft a sort of alternative to the orthodox path for, college and career that actually gives you a very fulfilling and meaningful life. Um, but you have to kind of tweak the variables to get it to work. So that was the first idea that I came up with, and I started kind of writing about that. And then I more or less was like, I knew the reasons why it was defensible, I guess, kind of coming from a a Francis Schaeffer kind of worldview, and then I just sort of fleshed it out, and then so that's probably a lot of what's in the beginning chapters, some of those more basic, like what I say, like the tools. Is there's these ways of thinking about things, kind of heuristics for worldview. Philosophy a little bit, not in such a formal sense as it's often thought of, but I guess that's what it's kind of pointing at. And then from there I started expanding into things that I learned were really important but are very rarely talked about in church, like economics and things like that. So that's kind of how it grew. And then uh, one of the other reasons that, I wanted to do it is because not having gone that traditional college route, and just, I guess I'm stubborn, and I kind of, it's the sunk cost thing, but I'm like, no, I don't want to go back and start from the beginning with all that. I'm just gonna do it this other way. And so, I was like, well, if I don't have a degree, this is a pretty good substitute. It's not to say that I'm right about everything. I don't even know if I necessarily agree with everything in here, but it does show that I thought a lot about a lot of things, and that I worked at it for a decent amount of time. So, that was kind of the thing. And what I put in the preface, about the concept of the rough drafts was really, what I gained from like Paul Vanderklay, that he turns his camera on, he just speaks his mind and then just puts it out there, and then just like don't worry about it too much.
Exactly.
And that was encouraging for me to start doing videos. And then I kind of was like, well, maybe this can be that in a book form. So really hope to inspire, like, hey, if you just keep typing, eventually you'll end up with a lot of words, and you can just publish it yourself. Like figuring out how to do that was kind of a fun experience. And so yeah, so it's all about kind of showing the process and showing the imperfections, because that's so important to how people figure things out, and how people learn things. So
I think it's a very big deal. I mean, for me, I'll sometimes talk about the quote unquote social coordination mechanism versus, using the internet more traditionally. A lot of the difference is the willingness to quote unquote put out rough drafts, to just turn on the camera and talk, right? Because you're more interested in the quote unquote social coordination, the incubation of the great conversation to get the ideas moving and the possibilities that that affords, than you are the perfect algorithmic podcast episode that gets a bunch of clicks but doesn't actually coordinate anything socially, because people are just consuming, right? And just going about their day, right? So, like, really to use this technology in a manner that, in my opinion, can truly open up social coordination possibilities, and all that would have to be expanded on, requires people to do the vulnerability of just turning on the camera and talking, or putting out a book. Because unless you write this book, we can't talk about it, right? Like,
yeah,
there's nothing to talk about. And there's also nothing to wrestle with. Right. And like you said, there's lots of things that I go, it's really funny when you write books, you go back and go, oh, I said that. Oh, right. And you actually wrestle with it. You say, do I still think that way? What's true about that? What's not? It makes me think of what you say here about tradition, which is really important, because I think what you're saying about tinkering, I really love. So there's a few things. First, I think an overarching question that your book is pointing to, that I think serious Christian political science orbits, is how do you form a people around a God who won't be pinned down? Like, how do you form a people around a God who won't be pinned down? Because, like you say, when the Israelites are finally free, the God who has delivered them instructs them to build not a temple, but a tent to worship. And this is after being in Egypt, where you got building a pyramid would have made a lot of sense. And God's like, no, just put me in a temple. It's cool. And then obviously with Jesus, the body, the temple becomes the body of Christ. So God won't be pinned down. Well, we know kind of how to form a people around constitutions, or common law. Like, we have a general sense about how to form people around something stable. Now, of course, that can be argued, because these things have to be interpreted, right? But there's almost the very problems. I guess what I find very interesting is that the very structure of Judaism and Christianity, and thinking them together, is that there is a political and social structure that entails within it latent the very political problems we're dealing with now, that are actually just kind of emerging in history at the right time in the right ways, right? Because what you see is that you actually need to have something that can hold a people together, that can move, or it's too rigid, and then it becomes oppressive. But then if you throw it out entirely, like one could argue, once you, like you mentioned, after World War II, that starts to occur, well, then people don't have any way to develop character. They have no direction. They have no sense of a moral universe. And simply saying you're free to do what you want doesn't give you the direction to know what to do with those things, right? So it's a real live question of how do you form a people and people around a God who won't be pinned down. And I think that requires very serious thinking. The thing I was also going to say when you're talking about tinkering, I certainly, a lot of my early years formed in taking seriously, I've mentioned him before, the great Friedrich Hayek, on this idea that no matter how much abstract, no matter how many PhDs you have, if you could be Albert Einstein, but unless you work at the McDonald's 8 miles down the road, you don't know how many plastic forks they need to order next week, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's no amount of abstract knowledge that can make up for local knowledge. The knowledge you can only get from an embedded practice in an embedded place, right? And of course, Hayek's whole point is that like 99% of what the economy does is actually, in society at large, is organize local knowledge, not abstract knowledge, but the local knowledge, right? So if that's the case, for me, it was kind of like, oh, you really can't, you can only think from a certain embeddedness, right? And then going to, David Hume and the Scottish Enlightenment and the Encounter Enlightenment, they're all extremely concerned about thinking that gets separated from limitation. It's not embedded in anything, because they believe that would lead to a philosophical tyranny, basically, because I have the right ideas and everyone needs to conform to it. And that starts looking at books like Dialectics of the Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer, who are like, hey, guess what caused all the modern wars? The Enlightenment Project. Because the Enlightenment Project, and not to go down this rabbit hole, basically made the dream an autonomous rationality that was not bound to anything. Like it was universal. It wasn't embedded, right? Well, that made possible total war then, because you could have a war of you could have a war for democracy or for the German people not getting food, that then you'd have to convince people they're going to get some of the food, like Benet Juvenel talks about. No, you can just have a philosophical war, actually, an abstract war, and that means global war now becomes possible. And I think that's a very serious problem. But the thing I was going to say, when you're talking about tinkering, basically, for me, from that kind of background, is that thought always has to be more like tinkering, not just abstract like abstract problem solving. It has to be from in something that you're thinking. Like, a way that I like to put it is David Hume and Hegel as well. Basically, are like, you can only think of how to run a wedding venue when running one, not before, because you can't possibly think of everything. You can't think of all the things you need to order, how many chairs you need, oh, wait, if it's really hot outside and the air conditioner breaks, what's my fallback plan? Oh, I didn't even know I needed to think of fall plan. So there's a real sense in which you literally can't even think things that you're not participating in, right? Like you can't even do it. And one thing I'll read, and then I'll throw to you for just any comment on that, is the reason why I like what you're saying about tinkering is because I think it helps us think why we need tradition and what exactly tradition is. Like, if we don't have tradition, the overarching point is we have nothing to tinker with. Like, it's not that tradition is perfect. It makes an embeddedness that then can be tinkered with. And if you don't have that, you can't even do thinking as tinkering. All you can do is, this is what we need. Well, you're stuck in the abstraction. So you're not, unless it's concrete, there's a real sense you're not even thinking. So I really like this paragraph I was just going to read, and then any comments you have on page 30. Tradition is the package in which we communicate knowledge and wisdom to pass it on. It's like a map of civilization that lives inside your head. Not everything inside a given tradition is necessarily worth passing on. They can hide a lot of errors. Traditions are designed to preserve knowledge and skills, but they do so unquestioningly, which is why we keep learning old wives' tales and why some ideas that are flat out wrong and destructive have survived far longer than they should on the basis of tradition. But whatever truly is good should be preserved in tradition. I really appreciate this paragraph because it's dialectical, to use that old Hegelian term. It's like, yeah, there's destructive stuff in tradition, but there's also good in it. And if you don't have a tradition, you can't tinker. Like
Yeah.
tradition is the basis of tinkering. I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on any of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, so this is and okay, so everything I write is usually because I heard somebody else say something with a lot of confidence, and then I said, I'm not sure about that. Something about that seems wrong. Um, and so, I have to figure it out. And so, so there is a lot of so I'm, I would say, I'm not conservative necessarily, nor am I liberal necessarily. Like in these, I'm going to be the fish out of water in most places. Like, but I do love a lot of the conservative people. It's like I would rather go to the conservative church and be the liberal person within
Sure,
there than go to the liberal church and where because at
sure,
least the conservative people are sincere about their things, even if they're closed-minded about some stuff,
sure.
they're sincere about it. And so it's
Yeah,
like, well, I can actually live with these people because I can translate what they're saying through whatever their boogeyman is and get at the truth, and there can be some kind of a connection.
right.
So that's the trade-off that I accept most of the time. But within those circles, you do have this kind of like we need to return to tradition, and and everybody looks at these great traditions, and uh, a lot of like theological retrievement and things like that, and that it's always this thing of if we just turn back the clock to this one point in time, everything and we avoid that one mistake where we took the wrong turn. And I just keep looking at this, and then I'll hear some reform people talk about this, and then I'll hear some Catholic people talk about it, and then you meet the Orthodox people, and they go a little further back, and and then there's the Jews have their take on it, and then eventually you just always end up back in the Garden of Eden. And if God, if that was the wrong, the big wrong turn, why did God keep the whole thing going? Um and and so I think that it's through these crises and things that he is working things out, and I think you see that there is like a progressive revelation through scripture, and really a lot of times there's a pattern of God doesn't give a law not to kill until after Cain and Abel. And so, and there's something in the fact of, even though it's like we know it's a tragedy right away, that if you actually look at the text, I think I defend this somewhere in the book. It's actually more of it's manslaughter. It's not murder. You could take it a couple different ways, but it's not he intended to kill him. He attacked him and he killed him. That's the text what it says. And so it's like, oh well, God uses our ignorance in some ways, our to make these mistakes, and then he kind of like a parent does, comes in and then gives the correction and gives the law that explains what he gives you the law most of the time after you made the mistake. So then you have both the example to follow and the law, and you can combine them. Um, so so God doesn't seem to be afraid of us making mistakes. And it's obviously wisdom is there's more of a burden on us as we've come through history. We have more to draw and more reason to avoid certain particular mistakes. But like you said, with the thing of being in a wedding venue and working there, that you will never know what problems are going to arise until you're in that moment. You cannot predict the unpredictable problems. And half of the time, at least, or maybe more, you're going to make probably the wrong choice. But then you learn uh, probably much more clearly why that is the wrong choice. And sometimes I think it's even like if you think about with traditions can build up a lot of people making the right choice, but not understanding why it's the right choice. And so we just all have always done it that way. And I think that's even where you get to the point of like with the baby boomers, and they had I think they had heard so much, this is the way things are done, this is the way we do it. And they actually lived in a time where there was not a sufficient enough crisis post World War II to just accept that unquestioningly. So they started to question it, and then found out that, oh well, not many people have thought a lot of these things through. So then they start making mistakes, and now we know a lot more about why some of those traditions were in place. But I guess you could say in some ways, they made very honest mistakes about some of those things, because I don't think that they got the full uh, explanation for why those things were in place. Like a Chesterton's fence kind of argument.
I think that is very well said. Well, one of the reasons I find the image of the tent so well, and you write, I like what you write here on page 32. The principle of tents before temples contrasts two key aspects between the two structures, mobility and speed. A tent is the home that travels with you and you can set up in a reasonable amount of time. A temple is more permanent, both in time it takes to build and place. So there's this kind of mobility. But it's also interesting because the temple has a certain conservative image to it, right? Like there's something very conservative about a temple. Like you're going in the wilderness, you're building up a temple. Yeah, you're building up a tent. People would not associate that with quote unquote liberal, just metaphorically, I don't think. And yet there is something about a tent that has a certain progressiveness, to an ability to progress, a certain motion to it. And so for me, like I do think a lot of times metaphorically, because metaphors shape our subconscious, whether we like it or not.
Mm.
I.A. Richards talked about, there are many people, Lakoff, different people who talk about that. And I do think many conservatives they have solid metaphors in mind when they think about conservative. They think about the home, the house, the community, which again, those things are not all bad, but they tend to be in our minds from just our lived experience structures, like stable structures that don't move, right? So the conservative is looking for reliability, which then gets conflated with not changing, right? Like something that doesn't change. Um, and the conservative tends to have a very good point in that, well, when we mess up, um, and don't, it seems to be better to progress too slowly. If you have to make a mistake, often it seems like progressing too slowly is better than progressing too quickly, right? Now, whether that's true or not, that seems to be the bet. And I think if the conservative is certainly talking about something like preserving a tradition, there's a lot of truth to that, because fixing a tradition, I think Wittgenstein put it well when he said that's like trying to repair a spider web with your bare hands. There are some things that when you break, you can't just fix them willy-nilly. They're really hard to fix. And the conservative sensibility, I think, tends to be kind of tied to that, right? But
Mm.
then if you're not careful, that's a trauma response that then makes you not able to adapt. And then you can also actually, in the name of Jesus, be, well, setting yourself up to betray what Jesus is doing, right? And so there needs to be kind of metaphorically an association that is able to kind of bring together this notion of something that is conservative, that because a tent also, like, you're going to have skills, right? You're going to have capacity, you're going to have reliability, and there's something that's kind of conservative about that. And perhaps, I guess, as you were speaking, I'm just thinking about perhaps the mistake becomes that often the liberal, quote unquote, they're mobile and they're willing to try new things, but not necessarily developing the skills or character needed to handle those new things, right? They don't necessarily have the tradition by which to not be overwhelmed by the existential anxiety or possibilities that open up that then devour social capital, community, and so on and so forth, right? Um, but the conservative, since they often are actually not emphasizing a tent, they are just emphasizing maybe the home. They don't develop the skills either. They're just nostalgic. They're just
Yeah.
trying to get back to a past. So they become defending something from change, and then it becomes rigid, outdated, and dies. Right. So what would it mean to develop skills and capacities to handle change? Right. Because like you're pointing at, I always think kind of with Jesus, just some kind of last thoughts on what you were saying. You have the conservative, the liberal, but there's something about Christianity that's concerned with fulfillment. Okay, so there's a fulfillment going on. So Jesus fulfills the law. Does that mean abolish it? No. Well, what does it mean he fulfills it? It's not always obvious what that means, right? But it does mean that actually in the thing that you're conserving, there's a real way in which the only way to conserve what came before is to acknowledge its fulfilled form. Like if you ignore its fulfilled form, then actually you're not, in a sense, conserving the tradition. You're leaving it behind in its name, right? Because you're not able to think that. And when I look at Paul, a lot of what you were saying, just for me, brings Paul to mind because he's dealing with live situations that Jesus has not directly taught on, that he's trying to think, what would it mean for Christians to deal with these situations in Corinth or wherever, that is going to be true to the Torah, but also true to Jesus in fulfillment, and trying to discern live what that is, right? I think actually, because I know later, and then I'll talk about tools. I think later in the book, where you talk about kind of the ethic of boomers being don't judge, right? I think one of the reasons that can also form is that without a tradition or kind of a moral teaching to give you a sense of right and wrong, you can't tell the difference between judgment and discernment. Like you really can't tell that difference, right? Where like what Paul is engaged in so much is discerning, right? Which does entail a judgment because you have to judge to discern, but it's not necessarily the same as judgmentalism, right? Like kind of defining people essentially by that era. But there's something about the lack of tradition or stable community that makes it very difficult to identify that the difference between those things that was coming to mind. So we need spaces to kind of generate and create and train discernment, wrestling with a tradition so that we can live according to it as fulfilled. But that also, to me, is why these spaces of rough drafts are really important, because actually they are creating spaces of that kind of development, right? Where temples can often have a preset doctrine that's not mobile, that doesn't want any wrestling, because that could be a threat to the identity of the people or things like that. I'd be curious if you have any thoughts to any of that before I talk about tools.
So
Not to put you on the spot.
yeah, no. I was following along, and then I'm like agreeing, and I was thinking about Gödel points and things like that. So,
Nice.
so yeah, I'll just go there. So I think I would say this is probably one of the things that's very very that I coming from that conservative Christian stance, and even in like the tradition of Schaeffer, and he's wrestling more with like the existentialists, but it's very much leading up to like the full blown like postmodernists, and so then you have a lot of people that are like apologetics minded and saying like we need to reject postmodernism and I think that obviously there's like when John Vervaeke talks about modernity and the problem of propositional tyranny, I think we can clearly say postmodernism can very easily lead to a perspectival tyranny,
Sure. Yeah,
because
yeah,
there's
yeah.
so many different views, and there is no shared, whatever. It's too much subjectivity, but you do have to have an element of that, because if you deny it, you'll just find yourself in these spaces where people are using the same words all the time and not speaking about the same things, and that can happen, at any level of contexts. Um, so, um, so I think that the kind of tent thing is, there's a little bit of uh, reducing the resolution, going back to basic things, focusing on, like there's certain, like, what, I don't think we need to negotiate the structure of the family. I think that, I'm fully on board with the one man, one woman for life. That's the ideal. It should have children, raised, that's part of the purpose of it, and like, so it's like, yeah, we don't have to argue about that if somebody's got an exception to that or whatever, that's fine. They're deviating from an ideal, but it's not, uh, we don't have to create a worldview that makes both things equally valid or whatever. It's not going to be helpful, and so it's like, there's a lot of things that um, I sort of, even one of the metaphors I use throughout is the parable of the sheep and the goats. And there's these basic categories. I was naked, and you gave me clothes, food, you gave me something to eat, drink, you gave me water, whatever. So you got food, water, clothing, belonging, being, being a stranger or being imprisoned. And it's like, oh, well, those kind of things, whatever, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the bottom ones, like that everybody agrees on. And it's like, well, hey, are we making sure that the people like maybe that we actually spend time with are they good in those areas? And like a lot of people aren't even good in those areas, um, or they're so dependent on some weird modernistic mechanism to get those things that like if they were in the wilderness and they had to live in a tent or whatever, they would not be able to meet those needs. And so that kind of speaks to like some kind of a basic level of competency and that people need to be able to develop, and so then from there, a lot of this book was stuff I wish I knew like out of high school or whatever,
Um,
and very much aimed at young men that are coming up. So the other thing was, um, we have four children. But our oldest three are all girls, and then I'm saying, who the heck are these girls going to marry? Which was much more frightening than like how do I raise a son of my own in some ways. And so that was me even thinking, well, I need if I want to live in a world where people are raising sons that will be good husbands for my daughters, it needs to be one where people take responsibility not just for their own family, but for some expanded circle out of that. And so that was even to think, well, then I need to be involved in the lives of young men. Then I can raise them up, make sure they're not creeps, and I get to have some say in what goes on a little bit there. And so that was a big part of the thing. But then it's like, oh, okay, well, okay, so what's if I'm a young man today, it's like, what's the goal? You want to get married, you want to have kids, a home, whatever. You need a job, you need skills, and you need to be able to meet those people and in community too. Not just the isolated family, but that you can live in some kind of a community a little bigger than that. And it's like, oh, well, those are very basic things, but like we've really put ourselves in a super complicated mess that makes it really difficult to achieve those basic things. And so it's like, well, let's just figure out how to simplify and reduce and let's throw lots of tradition away, and by tradition in that sense I mostly mean like modern technological things maybe, or we can use those. There's a lot of good things about those, the way they work too, but like let's let's just figure out what it takes to get that path. So and I think you can solve a lot of those things through local churches. So that was kind of another big part of in my ideal uh, scenario, is hoping that I could get people, pastors and such in the local church, to pick up some of these ideas, because it's not hard. Um, One of the things that churches actually have that's incredibly valuable is that they have problems that need to be solved. Um, and if you have a problem to solve, then you have an opportunity for somebody to serve, and you have an opportunity for somebody to train somebody else, and a lot of those things. Um, so yeah, so that's what it was kind of focusing on, figuring out that just basic kind of life path and how we get back to making that plausible. But a lot of that is through that kind of flexibility that you get of the tent thing, because you can't assume there's no formula that gives that. I think that's the problem. We had a formula for a long time. Go to college after, and the job will take care of itself, and you'll meet somebody there, and well, that's not working the same way. So we have to figure out the formula. And I think that the best thing is to keep it flexible, because, well, times will always be changing. So a tent is good for that.
I think that's very well put. Well, it's just very interesting because I think what your work is pointing to, and something I think about a lot, is what is, and I say political science because I think we are wrestling with what is what does it mean? What is Christian politics? And there are people who write on that. Obviously Niebuhr and different people, and his brother, who's fantastic. But this is a very hard problem that often leads to, well, various isolationist strategies, because you kind of say, well, the Christians should be isolated, and that can lead to technology is evil. Get rid of technology. And don't get me wrong, there seems to be something dangerous about technology, but there's often a certain sort of pullback, a certain get away from kind of is the political move of Christianity. When it does seem to me as if Christianity is doing, and Christ is presenting something that is much more nuanced, but that nuance requires live discernment in live situations and the flexibility and skill of the individual to handle all of that, both literal skill, and existentially, and psychologically. Because a few things, like the conservative nostalgia is often tied, because I like to talk a lot about Philip Reef. People want to return to givens, where it is given what is true. It is given what their neighbor thinks. It is given. They don't have to think about it, because that creates an existential stability. Like, if I know there's a very high chance that the people I randomly encounter in my lived experience are Christian, like basically the same as me, maybe they have some different views of infant baptism or something like that, but generally they're in the same world, then I am not living my life constantly wondering if I'm crazy or if my ideas have grounding. There's a certain shared language I have in my immediacy, and this creates existential stability, right? And here's the key: that creates a feeling of belonging because you have that existential stability, right? Well, global pluralism is where it is not given what the people you encounter with think. Maybe everyone in your immediate town is Christian, but you turn on the internet and you're hearing what atheists, Hindus, and other people, and you could say, well, the people online they're not as real as the people you encounter in your immediacy. Well, in terms of worldview, they absolutely impact it, because you hear the ideas, you see the face, it becomes something that is not so abstract to you. Difference is not so abstract to you. It's something that is more personalized encountering, and that creates a kind of existential itch, as kind of C.S. Peirce said. He's basically like, yeah, the point of thinking is to avoid thinking. To not have, because thinking is uncomfortable, and basically we use thinking to avoid it, right? Well, givens is a sociological way to do that for a lot of people, and it feels like belonging. But of course, it makes you fragile before difference. And also, I would argue it makes you susceptible to the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt said, because the way you get true evil is when it becomes everyday, and that requires shared givens. Blacks just are inferior to whites. These people just are bad, and we got to exterminate them, right? That's just what one does, right? Now, that argument has to be extended, but the problem is that a way we've traditionally created belonging and social connection for people is also the very same conditions that lead to xenophobia, racism, and mass violence, that we don't even consider violence. It's just what one does, right? So in that sense, the postmodern and more progressive impulse in the name of justice to get rid of givens, to get rid of determinations, is completely understandable, because where there's determinations, you can end up with banalities of evil. But if you go too far and say that everything is a social construct, then people go psychologically mad. And this is Philip Reeve's point. Like, people cannot live in a world where there is no determination, because that feels like chaos, and psychologically it overwhelms them. Oh, and guess what? When they're so psychologically overwhelmed, they turn to a strongman. And that's why popularism has come back. Because if you say that there's no gender, that truth is power in different things, which of course one must defend people like Derrida. The original postmodern thinkers tend to be pretty nuanced and interesting. It's just the movements that come out of them that become more blunt and problematic. Derrida's pretty fascinating, but without going into that, nevertheless, you get a movement that basically conflates freedom with removing determination, removing constraint, right? Well, that creates psychological misery, in which popularism comes back. And Philip Reeve is arguing that's what's going to happen, is that we've associated freedom with removing constraint. And in that condition, people are psychologically overwhelmed, and they turn to a strongman. But so to get back to the point, to me, what is remarkable about Christianity, and of course I have a bias, but it is remarkable to me, is that it is actually playing in the metaxis, to use that Desmond, the between space of that tension. It's like, yep, you need a tradition, But if the tradition is too solid, you get the banality of evil. You get people, oh, and also it disables people. They can't handle otherness. They can't handle newness, right? And they'll create ethics to keep out the other person because they can't handle an ethics that is open to the other person. So givens are dangerous. Oh, but if you don't have a tradition or givens at all, then you don't have a people and you end up in trouble, right? So you need a between space between givens and releases, to use the language or givens and constraints, to use Philip Reeve's language, right? That is the political project in many respects of Christianity. In the image of the tent is getting right at it. And it also, yeah, for me, it has a lot. Discernment is made in the girdle point, because that's the interesting thing. Like, you need a tradition, you need something that has a quote unquote map to it, precisely to find the places where the map fails. That's the weird thing. Like, you need a map to find where it fails, not to avoid where it fails. Like, you need a map in so much as you need it to get to the place where it fails. And therefore, there is no map. There's the girdle point, but that's only meaningful to you because you had the map to encounter that thing. And by that, you can update the map, right? Like, you can change it and give it greater dimensionality, right? But this is, well, to go back to your language, this is a life of tinkering. This is tinkering. The relation between map and girdle points is tinkering then. And Christianity is a political project of quote unquote tinkering, which, you could argue things like federalism was trying to get at. The American project has this weird blend of decentralization and centralization with the states. Now, that gets into where I think we actually have to rethink basically the American Civil War and what that political project was about. And that's a giant topic, but we really haven't thought that tension. And it's the same tension that I do think Christianity is gesturing toward. But the thing I would say, and then I'll discuss bug out the bag, because I love the opening of this section on page 37, is for me, I'm huge on Ivan Illich. And as I was reading your book, again, my bias, I was thinking a lot of Ivan Illich, which I adore Ivan Illich, so great job, is that Ivan Illich is absolutely skeptical of institutions and technology, but he's not de quasi-lieu where he wants to get rid of them. And the key thing that Ivan Illich is talking about is that the modern world is defined by disablement. And I know this has come up before, but it's the idea that, if you learn to build your own house, and you don't hire an expert to do it, you're kind of seen as a deviant. Right? Like, how prideful of you to try to build your own house, and irresponsible. Isn't that dangerous? Right? And so it becomes rational to be disabled, right? To not develop skills, right? Well, to make a giant jump here, basically under a zeitgeist of making disablement responsible, I do think it is difficult to have the flexibility mentally, spiritually, physically, that I think the political project, the socio-political, when I say political here, I am using it a little interchangeably with the social, because I do think the political, economic, and social really can't be separated. They're always already in operation. But I think that flexibility becomes very difficult to have when you are disabled, right? You're disabled from encountering otherness. You're disabled from building your own house. So then you're in the economic system, and you require then operating according to that logic, and that logic trains you into habits of thinking according to pragmatism. And then ironically, when you only are capable of thinking pragmatically, you actually become bad at pragmatic, because true tinkerers know you have to be able to go big picture, small picture, move all up and down. You can't just think of the utility. You have to think of the possible utility. You have to be able to have this kind of flexibility in thought, right? But that requires enablement. And I'm happy to say more on Ivan Illich, but for me, with him, he wants us to look at, instead of asking is technology right or wrong, and this logic would apply to anything, what are the dynamics the technology forms that we're not aware of? So just one example. I think, like, once you get the phone, for example, that can take pictures, you can go to a party and constantly take pictures of being at the party, because you don't know when to stop taking pictures. Like, you feel like everything you see, oh, that's a picture, that's a picture. So then you spend the entire event taking pictures of the event. That would be an example of a dynamic. So Ivan Illich is saying, I'm not saying phones are bad. What I'm saying is, when you are not conscious of the dynamics that the technology forms that then feel like are pulling you along, that's when you have a problem, right? And so what he wants us to do is become aware of dynamics. How does the laptop, how does the political structure create dynamics that pull us along? And I think recognizing that is critical for doing the work that we need to do to enter into the spaces where which we can train to have the discernment that's necessary to have the tinkering between the map in the girdle point, because that becomes a live discernment that is needed. Which again, I don't even think we can think now, because we can't tell the difference between discernment and judgment is bad and you shouldn't do it. And so we're very confused about those different things. But the first thing I was going to say is on page 37, I really started to go, when you said, if you had 24 hours to evacuate your home, what would you grab? What if it was 8 hours? What if it was 1 hour? What if you had to leave right now? I did read that and go, shoot. What would I went, dang it. But that's a lovely question, because yeah, that kind of frames the political matter or the disablement of the world that we're in. I love this chapter. I really also like when you talked about forgiveness. I will just invite you, because I this is the part where I said, well, I could read these underlined, but then I'll just keep talking for 40 minutes. It's just a very elegant book. I really enjoy every section, but I will pause and just say, why did you open with this? And any other thoughts on Bug Out the Bag?
Well, man, it's weird. So that it was hard to put it in there because I actually like had the introduction and the chapter 2, I guess, were one thing, and then I was like, I want to put this thing in here. I think it should be in here. Because it was thinking about somewhat of that like survival thing, and I don't know where I have it. The C.R. Wiley, man of the House, was
Nice.
the book I quote, and he's talking because he kind of talked about this wilderness thing and like, oh, well, there's a couple ways you can go. You can leave voluntarily and go into the wilderness, or the wilderness will just come to your door if the machine that is keeping things going stops to work. And you can see like even in some of these urban places, it doesn't take very long for them to revert to wilderness without the maintenance of people. And so I was just thinking about that, like, oh, and that this was coming out of the COVID thing, and realizing so much how just everybody is addicted to using fear as the way to grab people's attention, and that's a very disabling thing. And well, some of the solution of that is to wrestle through it and think through through these things. I guess you could say I'm definitely one of these people that thinks, let's just think about the worst possible thing that could potentially happen, and if God is who he says he is, then he should be able to do something about it. And so then, hey, we'll be okay. but you do want to be prepared for that, or you don't want to be shocked by some sudden crisis, and and it's not just obviously about the actual crisis that may come,
Right.
but by thinking about the actual crisis that may come, you suddenly gain that perspective of like, oh, well, there's a lot of stuff in this house I can throw away that I've been holding on to, or that you may decide that there's some important thing that you would need that you don't have, so you got to get that. And obviously, kind of the point that it gets to is, well, the most important thing probably is that you have relationships and that you have friends, and so figuring out how to get there is kind of the key survival skill.
No, absolutely. Well, it's also interesting because there is something about, wanting a king that for Israel that's tied to kind of wanting to be safe, right? Wanting to make sure that you have something to centralize the people, right? There's also something tied to not wanting to be ashamed in light of other nations, right? But then in a funny way, if you have a nation that's able to hold together without a king, that could become like more amazing, right? That can almost be like more incredible, right? In the same way that when you see all the birds in the air that are swarming and able to, they're just in unison operating, it's almost more incredible because there isn't a leader, right? And I do think once you get to the Holy Spirit, it's kind of gesturing in this direction. But there's a way in which that is all tied to vulnerability, right? Like, the not wanting to expose your vulnerability, but not addressing your vulnerability, right? Because you're not actually, say, learning to dwell in the Lord in a manner that can trust in his plan, trust in not having a king, right? You're struggling with that. But also you're concealing that vulnerability. But the reason why I bring that up is because often if you just learn, for example, if you learn to be the kind of person who was able to, on the drop of a dime, go out in the wilderness and survive, you may actually look like someone who's irresponsible and incapable, right? Because you may not have all the advanced technology that someone who was safe would have. You actually may look irresponsible. And that's kind of what Ivan Illich is saying, precisely because you designed your life in such a way where you were ready for that possibility, where you, and also you probably need less because you have the skills to do that, right? Which actually, funny enough, if you need less, you would look to someone who just walked into your home as if you were unprepared, right? And so there's a weird thing that's also, I think, at the heart of disablement. And then I think this applies spiritually as well, where people who are actually enabled can appear disabled, and people that are disabled can actually look enabled, right? And I think that's also tied to, like, if you saw, a king in a big temple or whatever, you say, man, they're really enabled. They really got it going on, right? But in another sense, actually, there's the disablement that's going on because they're not able to live in tents, because they're not able to coordinate according, say, to the swarm of birds that is going on. So there's always this very interesting play in the swarm I'm associating with, obviously, with the spirit, but there's the jazz improvisation, et cetera, so forth. But there's always this interesting, and I think Christianity is always very interested in this play where the appearance of enablement is actually concealing disablement, and the appearance of disablement is actually concealing enablement. I mean, another example can be job security or having degrees, not necessarily, but these things can look enabled and like, but then the financial crisis happens, people lose their jobs and they're done. They don't know what to do, right? Like, I always like how Nassim Taleb talks about that, and I believe The Black Swan, where he talks about the bankers in a financial crisis are worse off than the taxi drivers, because the taxi drivers can just change their route, and the bankers no longer need the taxi drivers per se. Their main source of income is gone, but the taxi driver, they're able to kind of adapt better, right? Whereas the banker, who looks like they've got everything going on, they're done. They don't know what to do, right? But that's also tied to quote unquote apocalypse being moments of revelation between the difference of this disablement and the enablement. And you could argue a lot of this moment of apocalypse regarding institutions is actually a revelation of that funny relationship between enablement and disablement, where things that look enabled are actually disabled and things that look disabled are actually enabled, right? And I think that's part of the generational divide. And I just read your section. It was making me, again, I adore Ivan Illich, and it was making me think about Ivan Illich and all of that. So I really appreciate it. And I don't think we think enough about how the dynamics of spaces or institutions or what have you train us into disablement, and how the name of the game is to avoid that habituation, not get rid of the technology, not get rid of the space. Because for me, again, I say that because I always associate a lot of Christianity with this logic of stewardship, this ability to steward. Well, steward is different than trash man. Steward is different than throwing out. But what are we stewarding? Well, dynamics, principalities, forces, spirits, right? There's a stewarding that's going on. And we just need the political questions of Christianity are tied to an awareness, discerning, and working with dynamics that to everyone else are invisible because they've been habituated into them in a way that they're not aware of. I'd be curious, not to put you on the spot, I'd be curious any thoughts as to any of that at all.
Yeah, well, I think, it's interesting, even thinking back to that parable, the sheep and goats, even if it's symbolically or whatever, but it's giving you the image that it's the king is the one that is asking you for a cup of water. You don't recognize that he's the king. That's who he is. And I even think, I do think within Christianity, there is this thing of like, well, if everybody's the same, then everybody's, equally poor, or this is like how it works out in communism or whatever. That's the bad part. But I do think that the thing is, what Christ is the King of Kings. Who are the kings that he's king over? And I think that ultimately it is all of his children, that that kingship gets down to whatever the role of the family. and then, so I was thinking about the thing with the givens. It's like, yes, everybody wants givens, but nobody wants to be a giver of givens. And that is what, that's a big part of, the thing is, a kingly role, a fatherly role is to take on not just to take care of what you are responsible for as an individual, but to take on the responsibility of others. So, and this is, I think, one of the things where, it's not necessarily too late. I hope that the boomers come around a little bit more. Like, I think that it would be great if we could gain, you know, some, if it, there was a point at the end of the chapter I talked about that I got to go back to where I grew up in New England, and sit with the pastor at our old church. And he said, I was wrong about a lot of the stuff we tried to do. I was trying to follow the trends and all this stuff. And he said, I failed you. I failed your generation. And I was like, wow, that was really great. And well, it took a long time for him to get there, but once he got there, then then his wisdom was incredibly valuable, and he could recontextualize all of that stuff. It wasn't impressive when he was just following Rick Warren and saying this is the way that we grow the church big. But once he had that insight, then all it's one of those time flips or whatever you put in there. Um, so yeah, and I think that's the thing is, if that kind of thing happens, that's great. But if not, it's like, you have to resist the urge to say my parents' generation didn't do that for me, so I'm not going to do it for my kids either. No, grow up, do more, be better than the generation before. And that doesn't just mean, like, give them more stuff necessarily. I think, we got most people of our generation got more stuff than our parents, and less responsibility, less opportunity to grow and learn. So, um, yeah, so I think that's a lot of stuff in there, and it does, like, I know in some of those later chapters that get into that, really the big thing of like agents and arenas, the environment, and those different sense of liberties. I didn't have the terminology. I know I liked it when you use it. But freedom in, I kind of described it in a different way by comparing, like, the masculine and the feminine aspects of libertas and liber and libertas, as like two different gods. But yeah, it's like it's so huge, and I think, and really, I think, there's especially in things designed for men, and there's huge crisis for masculinity and training for young men, and there's a big emphasis on, like, this martial aspect. And it's like, yeah, I guess that, but it's like, well, where does that ultimately lead? Like, well, I say we can have professional wrestling. That's the good outlet, because nobody gets seriously hurt. But, it's like, well, okay, if humans need to fight, or men need to fight, then, like, well, great, we're justifying war if in perpetuity. But I think that some of the strength of masculinity is, and this is a biblical thing. I think within the garden before the fall, the man is God gives the man the responsibility to shape the environment. And I think this is very clear. Like, Eden is the model. It's like, when you see a new construction site and it's just all dirt, but then they have that one model home and it's got the nice green lawn. It's like, that's Eden, and the point is turn all the rest of that dirt into places where people can live, and, like, and then, and that's so the strength and agency, especially in that masculine sense, is meant to be channeled into the environment, and that's stewardship through, like, cultivation, really, is what it is.
No, I think that's very well said. Was a few things. Yeah, that section on 204 where you talked about I'm ashamed of, where that was a very powerful section. And I like that chapter as well because I think you did a very good job of arguing that, the boomers are coming from the silent generation. There's a reason they think the way that they do, because the silent
Mhm.
generation often didn't give them any guidance or anything like that, right? And there is also, I think, like looking at Reef again, and I am partial to William Strauss and Neil Howe in their book Generations and the Fourth Turning, the first, the second, and the third, and the fourth turning. I think it is a very valuable framework. I do very much like the original book. I think the language of the fourth turning has gotten kind of a life of its own. But the original book very powerfully goes through history and argues that there tends to be four generational cycles. The first is the kind of visionaries, the religious revival. The second are the engineers, kind of putting their head, the silent generation who builds things up. The third can be the decadents, who gets to live off the success. And the fourth is unfortunately in the nihilist. They're in a nihilistic situation. And then you have the transition from the fourth back to the first. And I would, and I think Hal says the same. We're in the middle of a transition from the fourth to the first, right? And what ends up happening in the silent generation is they don't necessarily give guidance, but then they create wealth. So it seems like you can get wealth without guidance. So it would make sense that you would then emphasize freedom and just getting rid of restraint, because it doesn't seem as if the tradition is necessary for the thriving or the wealth, right? So it becomes a kind of reasonable conclusion to believe that freedom from is all you need. That freedom from is all you need. And unfortunately, that is not the case. And really, the existential and psychological health of the decadent, the third turning, is basically taken from the second turning, and then there's nothing left once you get to the fourth turning. But then, of course, the third turning tends to have the wealth by basically to allow the plausible deniability of the need of that psychological, and it can kind of conceal the psychological weakness in lack of direction, right? But then once you get to the fourth turning, it's not there, which precisely leads to the religious revival, because there's an understanding of a need. Actually, all that stuff we thought was dumb and kept us from authenticity was actually what was needed for authenticity. And you talk about that. So I think that's very important. The great trick that keeps happening, kind of to use psychoanalytical language, and I really appreciate Cadell Last on this topic, and he'll speak of, Freud and Lacan and different people, is that what you need is for the son to thrive is the quote unquote father, which is kind of that authority figure in Lacan, like the boomers. What they have to do is basically want to die for the son and for the son to be greater than them, because Zizek's also going to be using Christian language, right? And that's just very difficult to do. It's very difficult to do, but that's the only way that you can have the fourth turning not be extreme, right? There's a way in which Strauss and Howe say a fourth turning is inevitable, but they seem to suggest it doesn't have to be dire. You can have that dip that then, as if the previous generation kind of owns their role of being elders and making way for the next generation, it doesn't have to be extreme. But unfortunately, because they, in their minds, were able to make it on their own, there can seem to be a kind of injustice for them to actually set up the next generation to succeed. Because it would seem as if autonomy and freedom is all you need. Well, no, it's just that the silent generation, the engineers build the world in which it can seem that way for a time until it fails, right? That's a reason why I do like the Generations book, is it kind of gives you a way to view these generational movements in a manner that also kind of afford the possibility of, if not overcoming them, at least lessening their intensities, which I think in a world with globalization, stronger militaries, interconnectivity, that making these mistakes becomes increasingly costly at higher and higher of a level. So there is certainly something to be said about what ends up happening when you have the parents are not playing the role of laying down their life in hopes of the future generation rising above them, right? If that does not occur, you don't have, and actually it would be another subject, but there's a great scholar on Plato, Raymond Owen in the Agon is his YouTube channel, and he talks about the need to really view Plato as primarily concerned with the problem of transferring generational success. Because a lot of the dialogues we overlook, like Latches, as an example, is like the kids are like, well, our parents won all the wars and got the honor. What's left for us? Right. And actually, I would argue a lot of Plato is situated between the fourth and the first turning, and that he's constantly concerned with this idea of how does success pass on through the generations, and that he's suggesting that this is the key civilizational problem that has not been thought or taken seriously enough. And it's interesting to think of Platonism as a whole being tied to that very problem that I think you're pointing at. But no, chapter 12 I really liked, and I really liked how you talked about the silent generation. But again, I guess what I would also just say is that that idea of a certain, like the pastor giving that talk at the end of chapter 12, is that the boomer does not naturally experience themselves as disabled. They're retiring. They have money in the bank. Mm-hmm. Like they've got that. So that's another dynamic of the disablement being concealed by enablement, which then actually ultimately for me, the question becomes, what is our standard by which we judge enablement, right? Like what is the standard by which we say a person or an institution is enabled or not? And I think perhaps we should determine it by to the degree we can pass on to the next generation. Like if we're incapable to pass on to the next generation or help the next generation thrive, then it would seem to suggest that we're disabled, even if we have a lot of money, status, and power, that we're actually not enabled as human beings. Because there's something about human beings that is tied to the carrying on, like to the next generation. And then it would seem as if that very mechanism is part of God's creation. Like creation is creating, like this creationing on and on, right? And if the enablement is not there to continue that, then I think you end up in trouble. As a few more quick points, I do think also with your book, I was thinking about the idea that if your worldview or if your religion is dependent on not living in a tent, then there's a problem. Like if you need to not be in a tent, if you need a tent, like you need it, like you can't, then that suggests a problem. That suggests a certain problem that is going on. I think freedom in is extremely important. I think we're stuck thinking freedom to and freedom from based on Isaiah Berlin, but really freedom is found in freedom in. But we need to find freedom in a form of belonging that is not based on givens that are ultimately regressive, right? We need to find freedom in fulfillment, quote unquote, the fulfilling of Jesus. Now, that requires live discernment. That requires people willing to put out rough drafts and thinking that. So that becomes very important. Feel free to comment on any of that. As just a few notes, I thought chapter 2 on symbolism was really, really good. I really appreciated that. I also appreciate generally your biblical exegesis. Your ability to bring out passages in unique ways is very, very powerful. I think, a willing Hebrew, when you're talking about the woman at the well, like she's a woman of great character, a suitable bride for his master's son. Like those little details are really good. I think also, there's a lot of also where you're talking about the symbolism of nakedness that's going on. That was very well put. Bozat. I have a lot of underlines that I'm tempted to read here, but I'll give you a moment to comment on anything at all.
Yeah. So, I just went off on the thinking on the other directions from what you were at before, but yeah. Oh, so yeah, it's interesting. So the generational thing's definitely a big question, and this is a big thing of my my own story, I would say, because so if I look at my parents, my grandparents, most on my father's side especially, looking at my father and his brothers, they all grew up Catholic. My grandparents had their Catholic faith was an integral part of their life. They weren't necessarily super religious, but it definitely gave their life a sense of meaning. And then my father went out of that, had kind of born again experience and went in the evangelical direction. His brothers remained in the Catholic Church that they were baptized in. But then to see like how things changed from my grandparents to my father's generation, in comparing him and his brothers, the Catholicism turned much more into, I would say, a social justice kind of a thing, in their boomers and civil rights. That was the way that religion was going to improve the world. And then to look at like their kids, my cousins, it's just, ideological, um, uh, leftism essentially is all that remains. And it's interesting because it's like, on the one hand, that was a disabling thing for my father to take us away from that, because we didn't they didn't for them it was, how do we they had to figure out how to teach their children to uh, adopt a tradition that they had come into as new believers essentially, and that is not even necessarily the most geared towards the generational handoff. I think is one of the big problems with evangelicalism, is that it's really good at bringing outsiders in and not so much with the generational handoff. And so then that caused a little resentment, because for my parents, the answer to everything was just trust Jesus, and it worked for them, and it's worked for me too. But it's been, but Jesus has taken me through a lot of, like, I feel like I've taken this kind of survey of culture and see, like, here's all the ways, all the different churches are not really doing a good job. Here's where they're doing some things right. Like, maybe, and this is why I think, like, the meta modern kind of move is actually super valuable. People will complain about, like, the whatever cafeteria style buffet, build your own worldview. But I mean, in a sense, it's like, if you can't recognize that, like, oh, all these different churches that we now have, they all started at different times in different places, and they were all responding to some circumstance. And some of those circumstances, or similar ones, will emerge and continue to emerge. And so there's something that we can learn about how that church over there handled their crisis that we're facing now, that we didn't face. That maybe, maybe it's not the same. Maybe we can synthesize something between them and us, and whatever. So I think there's a lot of good stuff in there, and it's really, it is that flexibility. Like, one thing I think that's really useful about the tent kind of metaphor, or um, I think we don't realize how good people just in general are at building institutions and things, because we're always inheriting these ones that have lasted for generations
Yes,
all the time.
that's
And
right.
and the thing is that we put a lot of emphasis on the value of the thing. Like, let's say the cathedral, and say, like, oh, and people will say, we don't even know how to build a cathedral like that anymore. We've lost the skill. And it's like, well, that was kind of a failure. You built it too well. You should have built it with, like, and I mean, this is like, because I work in new construction, and some of these houses are, maybe you'll get 10 years
Right.
after the mortgage is over. But you know what? That's not necessarily a bad thing. If
Mhm.
there is some value in that. First of all, that it does create, that is a house that, if you only build the highest quality house, you will have many fewer people owning a house than if you build cheap houses. Like, cheap stuff, there's really good stuff about industrialization and making things cheap
Right.
and building things quickly. Like, it's amazing. When if you don't have it, it's amazing. If you have a nice house that you inherited from your grandparents, and it was built in the 17 or 1800s, and they built some of those ones real well. They built cheap houses too. They just don't exist anymore. Um, like, but then like, you're missing out on that experience of being at the beginning of something, of having to figure things out. I think there's a ton of value in figuring out how to solve a problem, and so providing that moment, like, because that's the thing, because that's where you have that whole turning of the generations. In some ways, it's like, we have to figure out how to give, maybe not in every aspect in life, but in some aspect of life, every generation needs to have something that they can wrestle with, that they can innovate, and maybe they'll pass that on. Maybe it'll last for 3 or 4 generations, but some other thing is going to expire that their children can figure out. Like, that seems like, that's because really the thing is it's what those crises produce is they produce people that are valuable, people with character, and that's the only that and that's the it's like souls, it's the eternal thing. But it's like what I think there is actually, like, God does seem to have some, I don't know what to say. It's not, it's not like we're all equal in value in some sense before God, but he does also appreciate the development of character, and I think that there's something to we experience this in our own relationships too. It's like a hard a hard earned trust or friendship is so much more valuable than just the ease of casual, whatever convenience.
I think you're pointing at something very important. It's always trade-offs. Thomas Sowell always says, the key to there's something about mature thinking that realizes it's trade-offs. It's not problems and solutions. Okay, you get institutions that are stable. You might get people that let the institutions do their thinking for them. Right. The problem with something successful is that it's successful. So you don't have to be, right? It becomes like the logic. It's a larger thing, but for me, the logic of like rationality seeks to create something that does its thinking for it. Now, this all has to be justified. We tend to create abstractions that then we build, and then we're set, right? Because the brain wants to save energy. It doesn't like using energy. Too bad being human needs you to use energy. Like if you don't struggle, you won't be a person, right? So personhood and struggle are strongly tied. But we have a frenemy brain that wants to save energy and basically keep us from being persons, right? And yet that's also the thing that can help us be persons. So it's all fun. There's a certain wrestling that's going down in the human being themselves, right? A live Israel, a living embodied Israel in that sense. But the point is that, you make capital in the system, so it does your thinking for you. You don't have to value things. You don't yourself have to determine your values and value things. You see, that's worth $19, and that is the price reflects some sort of inherent value. It's a little mysterious why and what, but okay, great. So the pricing does the work of valuing for you, right? And so you don't have to learn to value things for yourself. And, there's no doubt that if you lose the ability to value things for yourself, you easily could have a meaning crisis, because the only value you can have is what is given to you, and that can alienate you, and you can't own it yourself, right? At the same time, capitalism creates entrepreneurships and opportunities for people to pursue their own values and to make wealth and to do all of these things, right? So the successful systems always bring with it something that has the possibility of habituating one into its opposite, right? Which then tempts you with command economies in Marx, a command economy structure, which is impossible given the local knowledge problem and leads to all sorts of disaster. Like you have famines, even if you have plenty of food, because you're not able to engage in the correct distribution, right? You can't distribute things properly in the command system. And because you give rid of prices, and pricing is a means of distributing resourcing, blah, blah, blah. And there's no way that a central planner can know the best pricing of all things. So you get all these inefficiencies, right? So that's not good. But then that very efficiency brings with it the possibility of training you out of the ability to value things yourself. How do you not fall into that, right? How do you maintain the good of, say, capitalism, which is vast, without being habituated out of one's personhood, right? If you say, well, get rid of capitalism. No, you don't want to do that. So, you get rid of it. You have to somehow in the institution not let it train you, even though the institution or the system gives you the option to do your thinking for you, or your valuing for you, which is what your frenemy brain naturally wants to give into, right? So where does learning not to give into those very temptations that you yourself generates in light of your very success? So it's kind of rational to give into it, right? Because it feels better, right? Because you're not using as much energy. Well, you need to have a tradition or social resources or something that keep you from doing that, right? And it's just very interesting because, like what you're saying with the cathedral, the fact that it lasts forever could precisely get you out of finding out what humans are capable of, because we never see us making new institutions, right? So the success of the cathedral cannot help but bring with it a trade-off, right? In the same way that a crisis can be like the best thing that ever happens to people, because then they actually become willing to do things they otherwise would never do, that changes them in profound ways, right? So it it's always trade-offs. And if it's always trade-offs, then that in of itself suggests a certain girdle point, because no map can tell you the best trade-off, right? Like, well, it can, but that's the problem, because it may not be. Like, actually, you need to judge the trade-off each and every time, not just assume X is the best way to go versus Y. But that requires a live discernment. And it's just very interesting, because there's something, again, when I think about the Christian institution, sometimes entrepreneurs will talk about the startup mindset. No matter how big your company gets, you got to maintain the startup mindset, right? I think when you walk in, I don't know this for sure, but I think when you go into Amazon's main headquarters, it says day one, right? Like, they want every day at Amazon to be day one. Now, to what degree that actually occurs, of course, that's a different question. But the idea is that you can never in the success lose the initial fire that got it going, right? There seems to be something about the political question of Christianity that is aware of this problem and trying to avoid it somehow. Like that seems to be part of what is going on, is that precisely as you succeed and build a temple and build a nation, you actually use the abilities needed to be a people who can be a nation. Because I'm actually kind of thinking about the difference between a people as a nation and making a nation that does your peopling for you almost, right? Like, because you can make a nation and be like, well, we're just, we're Christians. That's who we are, right? Yeah, no, that's kind of the nation does that for you. You yourself are not actually being the people of it. And there's a certain awareness of that in Christianity, in my opinion, but of course I have a bias, that is trying to keep you from letting your institution do your Christianing for you, from letting your nation do your peopling for you, right? Like, God wants to make a people, but he wants people to make a people too. Like, he wants the people to make the people. But that's not what our frenemy brains want. We don't want that, because that's live and risky and scary. And it's like, yeah, but that's what we need to do. And I think then the question becomes, what does a church? I sometimes, and it's just everything you're saying so important. So I sometimes think about the difference as, like, what's the difference between an institution and an incubator? Now, of course, an incubator is also an institution, but it does not seem like an institution is necessarily an incubator. Now, I have to explain that. Like, an incubator is something that makes people a certain way. And I guess you could also argue that all institutions are actually incubators without realizing that that's the problem. But what would it mean to be an institution that is consciously an incubator? Meaning it is trying to create a certain kind of people that can be the thing the institution can never be, right? Like, it seems to be a part of the problem is that institutions are not trying to make people be something the institution itself cannot be, right? To go beyond the institution, to kind of go outside into the tent. What does it mean to have a temple that trains you to handle tents? Like, what does it mean to have a temple that trains you to be able to handle tents, right? Well, the temptation is like, we don't need tents. We have a temple. You don't need friggin' tents, right? Now, what we seem to need to have is like, you don't need to go make a people, because when we come together in the church, we are a people. No, we need a church that's like, actually, we need to make you be able to be a people outside the church, right? That's a different kind of incubation. That's a different kind of work. And that seems to be part of this kind of sending out in the spirit, right? I think sometimes, like, the Great Commission is tied to a spreading of a message, but there's also something about it that's actually like you're being sent out to be the people, like to do what the institution cannot do, and to live in. Yeah, Paul, of course, is making what? Tents. So that's kind of funny to think. I will talk. Chapter 3 is on. You have a lot of great sections, but I'll pause, and if you have any thoughts on any of that.
Yeah, well, let's look at the contents here so I can remember what chapters are which and what.
Take your time, sir.
Well, oh yeah, that was the one on evolution or whatever. But I think So when I the first thing I wrote, which is the tectonic school section, which we'll probably not really get to, but I start with that thing of the Great Commission and thinking like, okay, well, this is our thing, and I feel that it's either gets reduced in like one of a couple ways, because it's go out, and spread the gospel and teach everyone to obey my commands. So there is a thing of it, and it's either that it's reduce what the gospel is to a thing that's very thin and everybody can just say, yeah, sure, I believe that. Or you reduce the commands to something that's just say the words, essentially reduce that to like spread it out, but it's supposed to be a thick thing. And I think it's really meant to be a reiteration of the creation mandate in Genesis.
Yes.
And so, Christ coming and there's a lot of work that was still to be done from back then, and I think that, because that this is, I think it's very important, um, for people to realize. And whatever, I'll just say, yeah, it was not that the whole world was Eden. Eden was the only really habitable place on the earth, and then the goal was to turn the rest of the earth into Eden. But that was going to be, whatever, on a global scale. That means you're going to have to adapt to a lot of different geographical
Yes.
climate things. And so that means that there's only so much of a scale that you can work at. So that's the thing. It needs to be focus on like the local thing, so and I think about it this more or less. um Maybe we have to think about it at the town level. I do think we have to go beyond like even the local church as a community. Like a local church as a community is great, but they all exist in towns. And unless if there's only one church in a town, you got to deal with the fact that there's another church, and those people also in some sense have the same goals and directions. And how are you going to work with them? So I think, kind of like that's the next step is, or maybe that's the place to focus is like, and this is where I think like a meta modern thing, a metagelicalism is really like, I called it like, a tectonic ecumenism is the thing that I thought of. So because it's like, well, yes, everybody can have their separate practices on Sunday morning, but we should all be in, but maybe my boss goes to the church down the street from me. And so I'm connected to that church because I work with him 5 days a week. And he gets his hair cut at the place that with the lady that goes to the other church. And so, and having all those, those social connections and things that we all want them to not be, it's nice that you can go to a fast food restaurant and you can have your hamburger customized however you want just by selecting things on an app. But the trade-off for that is kind of sad, in that it's, very, very isolating. And I think, and I'm and honest, and I think that there's some really good things about some of those, even those kind of interfaces that churches could adopt. Like I think, especially because people are, and I was just talking, just the other day, Paul Vanderklay had a guy named Gavin on who I'm friends with, and he was telling his story and talking about being in the megachurch. And one of the comments I had on there is before he went, I actually wrote a blog called "How to Go to Church," and I was thinking about it within the context of this program. Like, okay, what if you have a kid who's basically gotten attached to a church because it's a requirement for an apprenticeship. So his goal is to learn a trade, but part of that comes with you're going to go to church on Sunday. Maybe he goes with his boss, maybe he goes with a family that's hosting him, whatever. And it was like, well, what is a person that's never gone to church like? What should and I'm like, well, here's some things you can focus on, some things to pay attention, like why are they doing these things? And, ask some questions about what was, the music and the order of the things they do and whatever. And so Gavin was talking to me in the comments, and he was like, really, he's like, well, what do you do with like your kids? Like, how do you know you can trust the people? Like, you just drop your kids off with like these strangers, and like, and then, and I was telling, well, a lot of these more modern churches, they do have some kind of a system where you're going to put in your phone number, you're going to get a sticker, and there's a barcode, and there's security, and things are, it's like, and there's background checks and all this stuff. And it's like, there's a conservative impulse to say like, oh, that's not church. Church is about like, just like we like the potluck, we like the potluck lunch. That was the tradition that we grew up with. Um, but all this like newfangled stuff, it doesn't feel right. And it's like, but a guy like Gavin will never come to your church if it's just weird standoffish people at the potluck. But even though that is sort of depersonal, impersonal method, it is it is kind of neutral. It's approachable. It's familiar to the people, and the thing is that's where people are at now today. People are they trust the app more than they trust a person. So use so the point would be use the app to build that trust and restore it, so then you can have that relationship again.
You're saying a lot there that's really important. So there's a weird way in which Paul is using Platonic philosophy and Aristotle and different things to speak to the people, right? So likewise, you use the technology that people like. Paul is such a cultural strategist, like and I do think, I guess I find myself often, I want to say defending Paul because I think there are forms that are like Paul screwed it all up. We need to get back to Jesus. And there is a part of Protestantism that becomes the book of Romans, and that's it. And that's a problem. But Paul's not just the book of Romans. There's also a cultural strategy and thinking that is really important there that I think we need to take seriously. And definitely there's something about Paul. I struggle to imagine Paul saying, no, don't use the screens. Don't use the screens. Because he'd be like, well, this is what people are, he'd be like, that's what people are familiar with, right? So you want to not overwhelm them, right? You want to meet them where they are, because there's something about spreading, and I think what you're saying on the Great Commission is really important. Like it's the spreading of creation, right? Like it's a spreading of the creative world. Eden is local and it's to grow. That's so important. And I think Paul, there's something about spreading creation that is also meeting where it's at, right? The question that I think about a lot, kind of that you're pointing at, is I do a lot with Hegel, and this is the part where I say I think, and I do a lot with Cadell on Hegel, and he's the genius who really brings him out, in my opinion, is and Hegel was someone I despised most of my life until I realized I misread him terribly. So I was like, oh, I can't read. Great. I was saying that the other day, is that there's a logic of negation at the heart of Hegel that is the key to making abstractions concrete and thus alive. And so what Hegel's pointing at is that something that does not entail its negation is basically doomed to self-symmetry and entropy. And let me explain what I mean by that. So there's a way for me in which, when I think about the relation between, temple, tent, Holy Spirit, there's a kind of anarchism in Christianity, but not at the same time. It's an anarchist civilization making, following the Spirit, but there's also order. This is where, Dante is so interesting, trying to kind of describe the order of heaven, because it's completely organic and it happens to make music. It's as if everyone just happens to play the like, a way to look at the order of Paradiso, as I understand it in Dante, is that everyone wants to play the note that makes together Beethoven's Ninth. Like everyone in their autonomy actually wants to participate in a gestalt, in a whole. Right. And it's mysterious how it works, but it's just that's how the love that moves the sun and other stars properly coordinates people, where people in their individuality want the note and to give themselves over to the note that makes Beethoven's Ninth, right? That the randomness is coordinated, right? And that's kind of the ideal, in a very real sense, that's the ideal order, right? Where everyone in their autonomy wants to do that of which creates music. Right. The problem is often people want things that destroy the music, dissonance. So then you use order to force them to play the note. But now that's not the divine order. That's getting into man's order. Right. But in this world, we have to kind of figure out the trade-offs between those things. But the point is that there's something for me where, and I think this ties to the generational thinking as well, the name of the game, in a way, is for the church to make a people who can do that which the church can't do in its name. Like the church is making a people who can do that which the church can't do, but in the name of the church, right? But then there's also something where like the work of a society or an institution is to make a people who can do what the institution can't do in its name, right? And then there's something almost about a family that is to make a people who can do what the family can't do in its name, right? Like each level all together at the same time is making a people to do that which it can't do, but then it's in its name in the sense of it becomes a testament to that thing in its very humility and equipping in that humility to do what it can't do, right? Because if the church was making a people to do that, which the church can't do, then that would be a testament to the glory of the church and simultaneous of its humility, right? And this seems to be the proper logic of generations, because the idea is that the ideal boomers would be if the boomers were to make a children who could do what the boomers could never do, right? Like that would be the proper relationship, and that's kind of what Goodell is getting at with is like the proper relationship is when the previous generation is making the younger generation do that which they could never do. That then is in its name, because then the younger is like, wow, look what they did, right? And then also here's the crazy point with that. How does a church or people or an institution or the boomers or whatever, how do you make your offspring capable of doing that which you could never do? Because mustn't you be able to do that thing to equip them to do it? You see what I'm saying? Like, how can you equip something to do how can you equip someone to do something that you can't do? Because that would suggest you don't have the ability, you don't have the skills to do it, right? So that's the contradiction in German idealism. Contradiction is where new thought happens, right? Like that's where the new possibilities open up, because a contradiction is not a logical contradiction. It's more the language that Hegel uses is it's more like an embryo or a seed, right? Like a seed is also a tree. No, it's not. Yes, it is. It's a contradiction, but it's a living contradiction because it's a tension, right? Which of course is very confusing, and one could argue, did they have to use the word contradiction? Well, it's fun. Language is fun. So anyway, but the idea is that institutions are they're only going to avoid becoming problematic to the degree they make some kind of contradiction central to their operations, because that also is going to, well, lead to girdle points, right? Like there's your map can't tell you how to do this, right? And the funny thing is that the girdle point and the contradiction are what make the thing alive, right? Because there's a humility that makes it open to something that's hard to understand. And when the church is trying to make a people do that which the church can never do, it has to be creative. So for example, if the church is like, how do we make people better engineers? And we can't be engineers because that's not our job and we don't have the expertise, but how do we equip them to actually be better at something we don't teach that actually becomes a testament to what the church can do? Right? If you say, well, there's something actually about quote unquote character or sainthood or spiritual discernment that actually would make you better at any occupation that you had. It would actually make you better at engineering. Then in that way, you would be able to make people better at something that you're not directly teaching on, right? That then is a testament to that. And there's something to me, and so that's the logic of negation, to make that clear, right? When I was saying the logic of negation is the idea that how do we make people able to do that which we cannot do? So you're negating, but then the negation of the negation is that actually that oddly is a testament to what you can do, because how incredible must you be to make people capable of doing that which you don't do? That seems impossible, right? And yet you're able to do it. So that's a negation of the negation. It becomes glory. It becomes sacred. It becomes extraordinary, right? So as you were speaking more and more, I'm just thinking about how the relationship between all of these things seems to be some sort of confronting of the question of what would it mean for the church to make a people who can do that which the church can't do to its credit, in its glory, in its name, right? What would it be for institutions to make people to do that which the institutions can't do in its glory? And so with the family, right? Because I think parents who are worth their salt, you basically want to somehow train your children to be able to do stuff you can't do. How do you do that? Mm-hmm. Well, I guess the critical thing here isn't it better? You got to be training them to handle surprise. You got to be able to handle otherness, diversity, things that are unexpected, black swans. That I guess I also bring up, because if we ask this question of enablement versus disablement, there's the question of what's the standard of enablement, right? Like, what is the standard by which we can say they're enabled, right? Well, it would seem to be that they're enabled to the degree they're capable of doing something that you're not capable of doing, or that goes beyond you, right? Maybe it's what you can't do because you die before then, right? Like, or something like that, right? Like Moses or something. So there's a certain sort of enablement being the standard. But what's so interesting about that, and I'll throw it to you for any comments, and then I underlined a lot of stuff in your book. I really like the chapter on evolution is very good because it actually is pointing out something that people don't know about the evolution, which is what you're saying about the simplicity of the wolf DNA and how it's actually like you get more complicated DNA. The wolf is the ancestor of all dogs, and his genes are much more resilient than the inbred subspecies we keep as pets. So there's an idea that all dog breeds are contained within the wolf, but the genetic descriptions of the wolf is far simpler. I like how you tie that to all things through Christ. That all needs expanded on. I'm happy to go into that, but I want people to know that there's a lot of sections in this book that talk a lot about a lot of subjects that do it in really interesting ways. And I just want to point to that in Agents and Arenas is chapter 4. But if you have anything to say about anything I was saying about making a people who can do that which you can't do, because I think about that a lot with this problem of stuff.
Well, I mean, that is the like number one question I'm trying to answer, because it's like, and I think, you know, well, I think about like, this was my, my frustration and say like, why, because what I lacked was mentorship. That's what I wanted. And I felt that I found myself in many institutions where there was either only a comfortability with raising up people who fit a certain profile, character wise, skill set, personality type, or if you had a similar skill set to whoever was on top, there was not really a good much room for you to be able to surpass them. You always had to be a little bit less than
Right.
the guy at the top. He set the limit in some sense. And I talked to one of my friends not too long ago about this, who's a pastor, and he saw that like, oh yes, definitely. The thing is that the most important question for like a leader to answer is, what do you do with somebody who has greater potential than you have, somebody who can become someone that you never could be? And obviously you can't bring them all the way there because you have you have the limitation. And I think one of the things, it came from like Peter Lightheart or James B. Jordan, who is really great, because if anybody likes is a Protestant, but they are listening to the Jonathan Peugeot stuff on symbolism, he translates it into Protestantism real well, and it's a little more rooted in like straight to the Hebrew concept, more so than a Catholic or Orthodox use of symbolism. But one of the things he talks about is that it's like the concept of like a new heavens and a new earth is like a continually ongoing things. Like,
yes,
and you look at the way the story of the Bible progresses, clearly like you have the flood, like that's a big one. But even on a smaller scale, there's always a new heaven and a new earth.
yes,
And even with the fall, okay, well, the first one you even say is, Adam is there in the garden and there is no woman. And God identifies the problem right away, but he says it's not good for the man to be alone. But Adam doesn't know that. He doesn't know that fully. And God brings all of the other creatures before him for him to identify, and he exhausts his knowledge. It's a Gödel point.
yes,
And then really it's actually, I think, probably a moment of despair in some sense, because he's seen everything and there's nothing there. And God puts him to sleep, and then he wakes up. And if you wake up and there's a woman, you are in a whole new world. So, it is a new heavens and a new earth. Uh, which I think actually, I think that is a big part of what ticks the serpent off so much. He liked the old world better, I think. But but then and then even when you have the fall or whatever, it's not punishment. It would have been bad for Adam and Eve, with the knowledge that they had, to remain in that place. They would have had very much probably the same kind of meaning crisis that a lot of us have, where we have two. I like to call it an Eden of apathy, um, and you know, and so they needed to go out into the wilderness. That was for their good. They needed to be out in the wilderness, and then they needed to transform the wilderness, and and on it goes. So, I mean, I think in some sense it is. I think really, especially like as parents or leaders or and institutions, a tent is a good symbol in this thing, and that it does have that temporary thing. It is like an incubator, or like a womb. It's a place where you can grow to a certain size, and then you can't stay there anymore. You have to go into the new space, and then you have a certain level of protection that allows you to fail safely. I think that's the point of childhood, and I think that's what churches could probably be doing better, is creating opportunities for people to try things and fail. That's the only way they can really learn. And then, eventually you can go out and do that which hasn't been done before, once you kind of exhaust your resources of your current environment.
I think that's very well put. Well, it's interesting as you were saying that. So first off, the section on evolution is very good. I think this is a major problem for many Christians, and I really like how you approach that topic. I think many Christians are very confused about it, and I really like how you thought about it, and really also just brought to people's attention that very often the evolution you hear in the mainstream is not always up to date on all of the science that has come out. And I think many Christians don't realize that. And there's also something to be said, something I always point out, like, let's say that Genesis entailed the entire history of the making of the universe down to every single detail. It would have made absolutely no sense to the people at the time. The book would not be here now, and there'd be no free will, because you'd have to admit it's 100% clear that a divine being named God made it, right? So there's kind of like, there's stuff like that needs to be brought up. But I really appreciated that section. I also like the section here, agents and arenas, chickens and eggs, and I love how you talk about that. I also really appreciate too where you talk about here, and then I'll talk about what you were just saying on why plants grow towards the light, and how the term, the earth was void. It's not really void. It's this kind of formlessness needing design. Like it needs determination, to use that German word, like this. It needs, and so that's really important, because then man as stewards is actually continually participating in this bringing into design, bringing into, there's this kind of mess of, it's not really, and you're also very right that this idea of creation ex nihilo is a bit problematic. It's not really a nihilo, it's kind of this undifferentiation that then is brought into differentiation. It is brought, and that also shows craftsmanship, right? That shows that there's something about being human that I do think tinkering is a key philosophical term. Like, we don't use the thinking is tinkering, or it's not even thinking. Like, there's a way I like to put with Hume is that thinking that does not become concrete isn't even thinking. Like, you don't even think well if you don't bring it into practice. You don't actually think well unless you bring it into tinkering. And there's something right in Genesis that's suggesting that the creative act is an unfolding of differentiation into form and design. And then, of course, you could suggest beauty, right? There's something about beauty that is coming out with that. And furthermore, notions of the true, the good, and the beautiful, which opens a can of worms, of course, should be tied to this understanding of a certain making differentiation, like bringing into form and design. I think that's a very important section. And then, of course, the question becomes, what does that look like as an agent in X arena versus Y arena? That is going to manifest differently relative to the agents and arenas that are in question. And that would also bring a certain skillfulness in design to be able to think that, right? That's a great section. But what you were saying, so also too, like, on the leader, like, it is very difficult to be like, how do I be a leader that inspires people to be greater than me, right? Because there's also a key here where you could kind of find a loophole and say, well, I know how to do that. I'll just be terrible. And then it'll be easy for my kids to be greater than me. I'll be a drunkard. I won't make much money. And then it will be easy for them to overcome me, right? No, the elder, here's the key. The elder has to be excellent and inspire the youth to be over that excellence, right? That's the kind of double move, right? But the excellence of the elder or the leader, and I'm using those interchangeably here. And I think actually one of the reasons we're confused about this is because we do have a kind of eldership crisis. We don't know what an elder is. We think an elder is a position in the church as opposed to a kind of person that shines with a certain way of being that inspires one to change their life in a manner that is more participating in new creation. But that, well, but then of course, if they had a silent generation as their parents, they don't know how to do that, right? But the idea is that the elder should have an excellence that then is hard to be greater than. Like it must be difficult for the younger generation to be greater than, but it must be an excellence that the younger generation wants to be greater than, right? Like you could argue a problem with the quote unquote boomers is that often the younger generation doesn't want to be like them. They don't want to be like them. That's why you have the rebellion. Like people are like, no, I'm not getting married because that's what they did, and they were fighting all the time. Or oh, they had a nice career and they have no work-life balance. So there's really a sense in which succeeding is not of the older generation, is not a success that the younger generation says, I want to be like that. They reject that success. So then in that mess, you can't have a success that inspires people to not only be like it, but to go beyond it, right? And part of what, in my opinion, perhaps the church is in the business of is somehow making a people that actually have a kind of success that the younger generation wants to be like and to exceed, right? Of which would go beyond the scope of the church, right? Because there's always that preparing for something beyond, right? I think that is one of the challenges of our time because, yeah, there's just something that people are not inspired by the vision of success now. Like, what is the vision of success? It just doesn't inspire people, nor does it call out to them. It's more, I'll throw it to you before I keep talking because I think about this a lot. It's more of almost like, yeah, you got to succeed because it's a threat. Like you're threatened. You won't have a home. You won't pay your debt. You won't get like, it's more like you have to succeed that way because of threat, not inspiration. Right. And that's one of the reasons why it feels like a meaningless success because it's kind of begrudging. Right. But there's this lack of a success in the society that inspires people to want that success and to go beyond it. Right. I'm not going to say for everyone, but then there's kind of like a thing where the people who are inspired by the success of our generation, you question them. You'd be like, you're personally lacking. A lot of the people who are inspired by that success, there's a question this is a vast generality, and I'm not saying that. There's sometimes a questioning of their character or their interest or what they want to do. It's like if that vision of success is fully compelling to you, then that suggests a certain deficiency. Now, I say that, and I know people who have been very successful who don't have the deficiency, but they know that success is a deficiency. So there are other areas in their life that they develop in, right? It's just very rare to find those kind of successful people, right? But of course, those people that I know who have done that tend to have a religious background, and they tend to have a religion because that, not always, but it suggests that there's something in religion that says, well, of course, Christianity is like, oh, you're successful? Ooh, that might be bad because the last will be first and the first will be last, which creates a certain self-skepticism that's healthy. But before I'll throw it at you on anything.
Well, so yeah, I mean, this is definitely a thing. I think, what I identify with the boomers, that they replace like a real confession or a real repentance with an excuse for sin. Nobody's perfect.
Yes.
And
Right.
it's all that, and it's basically, just a big quid pro quo. Everybody agrees. We're not going to judge. We're just, if I don't judge you, you're not going to judge me. And then within that, when you do have people that are elevated to a point of being like, this is a person that's a leader, this is a success, the form that success takes is that which they're naturally good at. They craft the definition of success to be suited to a certain person with a certain personality. And that will attract people with a similar personality, but then it's brutal to the people underneath them who lack those certain qualities.
Right.
And I think, somewhere in one of those chapters where I talk about that, thing in First John about confessing, and and Jesus John very clearly saying that, like, if you say you have no sin, you're lying. Like, you don't lie. admit what things actually are. And so it's like the one area where you have to be, where you really need to work to be perfect, is just being honest about your imperfection, not in a way that makes excuse for it, but that you really own your failures and that you're continually owning your failures. And then that instantly creates a thing of, oh, well, then it's like, what, you are constantly repenting and confessing to the same thing, whatever it is that you have a hard time with. I don't have a hard time with that. So I can surpass you in that. But
Right.
if I really want to imitate what you're doing right, it means that I have to confess the thing that I suck at, that I screw up at all the
Right.
time. And so, then you have, well, certainly we can excel beyond each other in different areas, if not necessarily in the whole thing, but the main thing is to be as honest about your own self, to have as much integrity as you
Right.
can. Like, integrity is the thing. And that's, I talk about it more in the book that I wrote more as a follow-up, which is, it's you can buy it for $50 because I didn't it's not really ready, but I was like, I wanted to put it on there so I could print the copies. So if you want to buy it, like, you'll give
Go right
Amazon
ahead.
more money, and but I'll get more too. But I start off with that thing because that's like, even this is that they've done studies, and this they know that this is that people believe what the most credible people in their life believe. So if the most credible people are Christians, you will probably adopt their beliefs. If they are atheists, you will adopt their
Right.
beliefs. And if they're, if whichever, those people are, if it's your parents or whoever, if they're hypocritical about it, if they say they believe all this stuff and what the way that they live doesn't act accordingly, it won't attract people. People will reject it. So it's as simple as that. But yeah, it doesn't require, Christianity doesn't require perfectness, in all things, but it does require that you be perfect in your confession, I guess you could say, or your honesty about where you are at, because that's the
That's
only way
right.
you can maintain integrity without being perfect, like
Right.
by being honest.
Yeah, and that then is setting people up for repression and all of the problems that come with that, right?
Yeah.
Now, that's again in psychoanalysis. Now, of course, no repression is bad, but total repression is bad. It's all a trade-off system. That's what Philip Reeve and later Freud is getting in. Like, if there's no repression, there's no society. But then there's a kind of repression that is kind of a lie. It's not really a necessary repression that then leads to all sorts of trouble, right? Now, we have to get into all of that. But I'm very interested in what you're saying there. Um, because, yeah, if the ethic is don't be judgmental, then there's nothing to confess because there's nothing wrong. So, like,
Yeah.
the ethic of non judgmentalism leads to there being no confession because there's nothing to confess, which then confession is the way that, like you're saying, creates integrity, reliability. Well, it makes them human, like,
Well, if you
because
yeah, if
because
you make
otherwise,
if you offer a confession in that environment, though, you are causing trouble. So
well,
that's
this is
the that's the
Bonhoeffer in his book Living Together wanted to kind of bring back public confession. He wanted to bring confessionism into the Protestant church because he thought that actually there was a major problem here where there's also something, and I don't think Bonhoeffer says this, but he's kind of, in my opinion, pointing to it. The testimony is now entirely a story of how you were saved, right? And that, of course, is, how God's working in your life. No, it's not always that. People tell testimonies where the Spirit got them through X, Y, and Z, but often it's tied to a salvation story, right? But the testimony can also be an opportunity actually for confession, and actually to humanize and actually to tell stories about how that thing being confessed actually opened one up to new creation or actually elevated them. Like, the testimony can be a broader category of potential storytelling that brings the community together. And it actually would be interesting, as I'm speaking, I don't know, to think the storytelling and eldership and testimony and all of those things together and how they've kind of formed, right? You mentioned Watchman Nee quite a bit, and I always think about his story. Mr. Dillard introduced me to him, so I appreciate that. But um, I think I'm also thinking about, as you were speaking there, yes, so the confession creates, well, because the confession also oddly, if I know my elders are imperfect, then I actually feel like they can be models for me because I know I'm imperfect. And so, oh, they actually are like me. Like it's hard to believe that someone can be a model for you or someone you should try to be like if they're not like you, right? If they're perfect, then I can't be like them unless I convince myself I'm perfect, which creates pride, or I have repression, or I just follow them and now I have a totalitarian strongman structure, right? So the confession is really big. And I think, yeah, I think what ends up, well, actually, as we're speaking, yeah, I think there's also an issue here where basically people only confess to the degree where they say I was a sinner and then I was found and I was saved. They don't continue to confess after they're saved so much because then there's kind of a nervousness of what the church should do about that. And if the church is mainly in the business of getting people saved, it doesn't have the discernment of sanctification, then we don't know what to do with that so much. We may break it down into isolated small groups that talk about marriage, but to have the church really kind of focused and thinking about that is more difficult. So this would need to be expanded on, but there's something here about actually not being able to handle post-salvation confessions because we don't know how to think that. Please.
Your sins will transform into respectable ones. You might figure out how to stop doing the things that are like absolutely not tolerable to being in that community, but you may replace those patterns with something else.
For me, Michelle and I will sometimes talk about how, okay, so you're not addicted to pornography or alcohol, but you're actually still addicted to fear. You're still worrying. You haven't developed courage. We don't tend to in the church identify sins like fear. But the fearful are cast into the lake of fire first in the book of Revelation. So we tend to think the only things we need to confess are like the obvious sins, like, adultery or something like that. We don't think about the need to confess, in your head all day, talking about how much you hate. You got a voice in your head about how mad you are at your boss, or just we don't think it's a sin to make decisions that avoid risk, right? Isn't that responsible? So there is something here where it's interesting. There is something where we may not have the grammar to think, I'll say the sins that keep us from sanctification. We have a grammar for the sins that keep us from salvation, but not a grammar for the sins, quote unquote, that keep us from sanctification, right? And developing character, which then if we don't have that, then of course we don't have elders that can inspire the younger generation to be excellent and beyond them because they don't have a grammar to even think that matter, actually. And that's not part of the incubation of the church. So that's very interesting as you're speaking. I'll have to ponder that. I have so many sticky notes. So I'm also thinking about how basically boomers have made spaces via non-judgmental spaces. Like the idea is that we develop properly if we have non-judgmental spaces. Because spaces and how we design spaces is tied to the kind of people we want to make or think we should make. And there seems to be a certain theory that the less judgmentalism there is, the more people will properly develop. Like they'll inhabit spaces where community happens, where friendship happens, where people realize the fullness of their potential. What's very interesting is as we're speaking, because I really do like how you focus on that in the book toward 200. It's kind of like I'm now thinking about Jesus talking about, hey, if you take out a demon, but you don't put, the spirit in its place, you're going to get 7 more. It's going to be really bad. Judgmentalism, which leads to a religious spirit and pride and all of that stuff, is very problematic. And so we kind of remove that. But we didn't actually put a positive in its place. We just put don't be judgmental, which then actually leads to chaos because you don't know what to do and what not to do. When really we needed to make spaces, I want to say, like, there's a difference between a non-judgmental space and a space that incubates discernment. And obviously, I'm really emphasizing discernment in this conversation because I really think the girdle point is where thinking becomes personal and discernment and life, right? So what we've done is we've made the mistake of thinking a non-judgmental space is the same as a space that incubates discernment. Because it's a kind of reasonable mistake in the sense of the idea. It's like judgmentalism keeps you from really knowing a person who they are. Because you say, oh, they're blue collar, I'm better than them. And the idea is, no, don't be judgmental. you'll actually see that they're more than that, right? Is kind of the theory, or that's how colleges may put it, or people put it forth. There's like judgmentalism gets in the way of encountering the person, right? So there's this idea that if you're non-judgmental, then that will train discernment. It will, well, certainly they believe it will train empathy, but then we have a problem where empathy and discernment are not equal. They're different. They perhaps are different things. And I actually don't think we know what empathy is generally. We conflate it with sympathy. But anyway, but a space that incubates discernment actually requires intention. You can't just have the absence of judgmentalism and believe that that will then create character and discernment, right? Perhaps it gets in the way of judgmentalism that keeps you from encountering the other. But if you encounter the other and you don't have the skills or psychology or existential or ability to handle it, it blows up. It doesn't go well. You drift away, or you end up you end up overwhelmed by anxiety, and so you're returning to popularism, right? So we need spaces that incubate discernment, live discernment. But then what standard are we discerning according to, right? And if you don't have a tradition and we don't know the function of the tradition, then we don't know what we're doing. I mean, I think a lot of churches end up saying, well, we're discerning to make sure it is correspondent theory of truth matching sola scriptura. Is it in the Bible? Can we find it? And you're discerning what matches the text perfectly, right? But of course, that's very problematic, because that's not exactly what we're discerning in Paul. We're discerning something beyond that, on the edge, on the horizon. Well, how do you do that? That's where I think the tradition becomes that space of wrestling with the ideas and the thinking. And I think it's much more tied. I know Joseph was talking about holy disagreement in Judaism and that culture of conversation and thinking. I think it's in that space the discernment is found. But you have to make that culture where it can occur. I think the online space is doing that. This is what the social coordination mechanism is getting at, because it is in that space that I think our ability to discern is tied to how we use language. I really do. I think like the way we use language and our ability to discern is tied together, because the subjectivity and language use are tied together. The kind of persons we are is tied to how we use language, and that's tied to what we can even think. And we can't discern well if there are limits to our thinking. I also wanted to say, just based on the sections on evolution as well, like what we adapt to is relative to what we can discern. Like we can't adapt to something we can't discern. So if our discernment is limited, we're not going to adapt, because there's something about because evolution is always inseparable from the environments. Like people kind of lose sight of that. Well, when it comes to be human beings with language in mind, then actually the environment we should adapt to is not given, because it's not given by our materiality or just our materiality. It's also tied to what we choose to think and what we choose to talk about and what mental environments we put ourselves in, right? And the kind of environments that are more metaphysical we can adapt to will be relative to what we're capable of discerning. So if we're not able to discern the movement of the Spirit in these more subtle ways, or if we're not able to discern these sins that keep from sanctification, then you're not going to be able to adapt in a manner that is going to be realizing something closer to sanctification. And then you won't even be able to discern that you didn't so adapt. And that's actually kind of the greatest, you could say, I almost want to say, we have made it to page 77. I've underlined a lot, so we'll just have a lot more talks. How about that? So I think we can make it to page 100 here. So the book is really full of a lot of important. It's just really, really great. I really enjoy reading it. But what I was going to say is, like, you could say like perhaps one of the greatest horror, I want to say horrors or troubles of when a generation fails the next generation, is they also can potentially set up the next generation to not even be able to discern the failure that they're in, right? Because they just pass on the enclosure and don't give them the discernment skills to see the enclosure that they're in, and then that younger generation therefore blames themselves for everything, right? And that's why the fourth turning tends to lead to a certain nihilism. Like nihilism and enclosure go together, like something without exits, right? And so what can happen is if the last generation does not pass on discernment to the next generation, and the last generation perhaps did not offer models of success that can inspire, or models of success that are simply the full human being, then also the next generation may not have the discernment to be able to tell that that impoverishment happened to them, and therefore it's their fault, therefore they're damned, therefore there's no hope, and you get that sort of enclosure. But I'll pause.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. So it kind of, I don't know if I had really finished the story with like when I was talking about my dad, and him, his like kind of departure from Catholicism and into evangelicalism. I thought I saw this as like at a certain point, like this was a detrimental thing that happened to me because I didn't get the full cultural package. There wasn't a strong emphasis like go to college and do these things and then, get into adulthood and be like, man, it would have been really nice if I had this same advantage that everybody else has. But then, a few years later, really see, and like sometimes it's like, oh, well, that has now become a dead end for for everybody else my age. So it's like, well, I'm sort of, I feel like I identify a lot with the Gen Z people in a lot of ways. Like in, I got there first, you know, um, so. But that's good because then it's like, okay, well, I know that I'm not coming into a world where you inherit a path and a formula for success. You need to figure out something new. And so that's where, that's why I wrote the book. That was me taking a stab at things. And, this is the goal really is to inspire conversations like this. And then hopefully it leads to real actionable things happening. But yeah, so that yeah, the expiration date on those formulas or whatever is an important thing to recognize.
Absolutely. And actually, funny enough, the likelihood of seeing the expiration on those formulas can actually be tied to a failure to follow those formulas, which also suggests that there's always the potential for redemption and grace and how those things actually all work together. And I don't think it's by chance that we do tend to see the people who are interested in what I consider a new kind of cultural movement that we're seeing online with the TLC, philosophy for the social coordination mechanism, that a lot of these people are individuals who don't fit neatly into a success box, actually, or that happen to have a certain people growing up that made them see something that wasn't that which the society would otherwise have led them to see, right? So there's a certain grace. God, he comes for the sick, right? I think that, well, and also too, like, I like this line on 77. I think this is really important. It claimed, generally the theory of the Darwinian, worldview, it claims that evolution favors the survival of the fittest, but the only determination for what fitness is that which survives, right? There's a certain circularity there too. I think that's really important because basically the suggestion there is we need to like discern what is fitness, like what is it that we want to survive for or according to, right? And that's where the discernment kind of comes in. We can't just, because I guess what I'm saying is that logic actually kind of dominates our social structure. Like if you survive, well, therefore you must have been the best. Well, actually, what if the system's just really bad and the people that survive are the bad people that it makes survive? And we say, well, that means they're the fittest, right? But is that the fitness we want? Some people argue, and I'm quite sympathetic to this argument, is that um global corporate, like very large corporate structures, the ones it tends to select for are going to probably be more sociopaths or psychopaths even, but more sociopaths, meaning that they actually they don't emotionally feel as much stepping over other people or doing what they need to do to succeed, right? Whether one agrees with that argument or not, it's very at least possible that our society success and sociopathy may correlate, right? Well, then the system selects for sociopathy, and the fit are the sociopaths. Is that what we want? No, is that what we want? And if you say, well, we don't get to decide, did you decide that? Who gets to decide? Like you say, well, we don't get to decide, the system does. Oh, okay, so that's kind of a truism as well, because because who says, right? It self-justifies itself. It's an internally consistent system. But that's kind of where, in some respects, the boomer has left us, right? Is kind of the idea that, well, what survives is fitness. But what the younger generation kind of has a sense of is, but what if the fittest is sociopathy? Like, what if it's actually dysfunction? Is that what we want? And it's kind of like, I don't think it should be. But then you kind of are led to say, well, that means I need to value something different. Oh, well, that means I need to make the communities that can value something different. And that's where the religious revival, the first turning, kind of begins, because it becomes a question that must be asked and must be addressed. And the younger generations, precisely in the deficiency, find themselves thinking it.
Yeah, I wrote it's not in the book so much, but because there's something I kind of got more interested in towards the tail end of writing it. But um, I think that you got your vast majority of society, whatever it is, the 99 sheep, you could say, the who who's excluded or whatever. A lot of times it's if it's favoring the sociopaths, it's going to be targeting the autistic as the heretic.
Right. Yes.
And then, we now live in an age where autistic people have crafted a lot of the infrastructure that our society runs on, the whole internet, essentially, and they did that as a defense mechanism and stuff, and a lot of good innovation that everybody can benefit from, but like it's definitely, I'd say, I call it, it's like a desire for that like vibes based community, the givens or whatever. It's definitely coddles the potential for the sociopath. So if you get rid of your lost sheep, but you get a wolf instead, and that's, I think, I think that's something that requires active participation to maintain. You won't find a system. Your systems will keep like oscillating but between them or whatever. I mean, because like a totalitarian system can actually weed out the sociopaths in some ways. It's like, hey, if we have a surveillance on everything and we observe everybody's behavior, we can find the really bad criminals. We will get the serial killers, but it's not necessarily great for the most people. So there's it's another one of those trade-offs, but probably something that needs to be handled at a smaller scale where it's more manageable.
Well, I think you're getting at something very important, and alas, dinner is coming up here, my dear friend. But
Yeah,
we will do this again. There's a difference between, so if the autistic responds to the sociopath by creating an entirely new infrastructure, that's a positive step. But if it doesn't lead, so for Hegel, again, I referenced it. If you have a dialectic, but it never leads to speculative reason. So another way to put it, if you have a response, but it doesn't lead to, well, now what will we value new? If you're still operating in the same logic of the sociopath's world, even if it's an alternative to it, it is still in the same frame, right? So then you end up falling back, as Hegel would say. You just kind of fall back into it. It's a revolution that ends up being a full circle, right? So in order, so you create an alternative, but the alternative infrastructure that the autistic has made needs to be used not according to the logic of the system that then inspired that alternative, but to think a new value, a new ways. And that's where using the internet for social coordination and creating these spaces where we can train discernment, live human discernment, becomes the kind of sublation of using that infrastructure. That please.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, it's funny. It's the conversation you just put out or whatever, but the Silicon Valley sex cult, that's the autistic attempt to
yes, it is.
enjoy the hedonistic lifestyle that the sociopath enjoys naturally, but that they're not really. You're creating a workaround. You should really be creating a system that's better for your soul. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you see what ends up happening is that can just go in the direction of being free from determinations again, because you made an alternative. The sociopath was like, well, I'm just going to be free from that system entirely. But now you have no system. and you're back in, and that could end up in forms of problematic transhumanism. Now, I think it depends on what we mean by that term, but there can be a certain escape from determination, total freedom, not even biological restriction anymore. CRISPR technology in the gene editing stuff is going to be a major issue. But basically, to your point, what ends up happening is those sex cults, as we talked about at the net, there is a certain sort of, you're still following, let's put it this way, you still want what the sociopath wants. You're not different in the desire. You're just finding an alternative way to get it. And basically, this is where I do think, as Cadell emphasizes, the socioanalytical questions become very important because, as Lacan would put it, if we're still in the register of desire, then we're in trouble because we're seeking objects of desire that lead to pathologies. You have to move from desire to drive, or extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation, as I would put it. You have to be motivated by something alternative. Now, ultimately, for me, I think that's tied to beauty, which is very different. Like, there's like, what do we mean by beauty? Jockin and I, we all talk about that. But if we're still actually motivated for the same thing as the sociopath, then even if it's in a rebellion against the sociopath, it's actually not that different. But this requires communities where we can think that difference, we can discern that difference, and institutions and so on that enable us to think that difference. And if they're not there, then we might just be trapped in the dialectic and never move to speculative reason. Hegel, his whole point of the dialectic was to speculatively reason beyond it, not to just go dialectically back and forth, but that requires the ability to engage what he calls judgment, discernment, like value discernment becomes very important. So I agree with all that.
I want to make one prediction about the CRISPR thing. This is my theory. You're going to get one generation of super intelligent kids, and then the parents are going to find out that that's very difficult to raise kids that are smarter than them, and then you'll get a generation of the human equivalent to the golden doodle, or so
that is hilarious. I think also we will find out, it will be very interesting with the CRISPR to find out if there were trade-offs we didn't know were there. Oh, those genes we thought were bad, actually they had another function at the same time that was really important. And then, funny enough, I do wonder if we're going to find out that actually higher intelligence, quote unquote, may actually crowd out the likelihood of creative eurekas. So actually higher intelligence may just create people that can only follow orders, or kind of work with determination, not necessarily have a daydreaming breakthrough like Einstein would. Oh, there's so many. I'll just read a few lines here as we run out of time. I love this part, but an inquisitive chicken could also ruin the future prospects of its offspring by trying to peck its egg to see what the egg contains. I'm just going to read some sentences because they're beautiful. I really like that part because it's like, oh, I want to see what's inside the egg. Well, you kill the chick. It doesn't grow and it doesn't wrestle and strengthen itself. And that also gets into why rationality needs non-rationality. It needs tradition. It needs something that's beyond its scope, that it doesn't peck into. Otherwise, it dies. That's a very important relationship that you're describing there. And Michelle, I think, she made a pumpkin lentil soup. That was incredible. I wish you could have some. It's really, really good. That was a beautiful line. I really love that because that's so true. And that to me describes the relationship between rationality and non-rationality that counter-enlightenment thinkers were getting at. That was really important. I love when you talk about telos and spirit. I did want to say also too, where school right now, like one of the ways we're getting away with this inability to discern is because we basically make everything isomorphic, meaning what succeeds in school is what succeeds at work, which is what we want to believe succeeds in family. So you need one kind of thinking and it goes the whole way. But under pluralism and diversity, that breaks down. And also, as technology accelerates, you don't know what jobs are going to be in the future. So you can't have a school system that is like the job market anymore. And you have to rethink all of the structures differently. But theoretically, if you could have every institution or space of society isomorphic, all the same, then you'd be good. But actually that makes us incapable of creating new structures, new determinations, new designs, and it becomes very problematic. I was going to say that, and I actually need to add to that, but I'm just going to read some cool sentences. I like this part where you talk about school spirit. This is really good. When we speak about spirits in reference to gods and powers, it's easy to assume ancient meant something like ghosts or angels, invisible creatures with the power to float through walls. There is no reason to disbelieve the gods or powers can and do act this way, especially in places where people still believe and expect it. But the better way to consider the impact of spirits in our world is something like school spirit. I think that's really good. And you go into
That's
detail on that.
PVK. You got to give credit to PVK for that one.
Thanks, PVK. Well, you did a really good job of PVK in your book there. So that was really, really nice. I really like this section. I'll give you, I hate to rush, so I'll just stop here. Anyway. Any thoughts about any of what I was reading just now? Either way, egg, spirits, anything.
I'm also hearing noises that tell me I probably
Yeah.
should be
Yeah.
getting
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
So,
See,
yeah.
you have kids. You have kids. You have four. I have four. Yeah. I know. Well, we will pause here on because I love when you talk about the spirit of a nation. That's going to
And
bring
everything
us
is it's I read it all on YouTube, so people can go listen
people
to
on
it, you
YouTube.
know.
Go listen
Yeah.
to it.
And leave
I will
comments. That's what I would really like, is for people to
get comments
leave
on it.
comments on the videos.
Well, because the point again, if no, so I've folded this page to mark where we are. So I'll put it there and then continue. Um, if people don't write these, we can't have these conversations. And I think basically we are entering the age where self-publishing, doing your own books like Michelle and I do. The book is entering not to go down an entire theory of the book, but we are entering the age where the function of the book is changing. And what I mean by that is for most of history, the book was the kind of totalitarian, kind of the authority, the neurotic kind of, this is the authority. The author is the dictator, you dictate writing. And it's like, this is the end of the conversation. Like you read this book and you don't have to think it anymore because you know everything, right? Well, when Barthes and the postmodernists kind of deconstructed that notion of the book, it seems kind of terrible, but actually it can open up book as a space of conversation and affording conversation and affording relations. And that is what I think we're seeing the book. The book is entering this new form of functioning online. And I think it's extremely important. And I have a lot of hope for the book, actually, precisely in this age when it seems like the book is doomed. I think actually we're going to finally kind of start to understand what the book is for, actually. It is not, the book is supposed to be a space where people come together in the book like a room and they actually converse and they learn to discern and they learn to think together. And books become more like architectural spaces in which we enter and are formed by. And I think the ease of writing books and putting them out means there are many rooms. It's a house with many rooms, and there are many different ways to be formed and many different people to meet and speak. So I'm grateful that you wrote the book. We'll continue to talk about it. And Mrs. Sartori, thank you for your time today, sir. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me. It was a blast.
Absolutely, sir. We'll do it again. Thank you so much, Mike. I've
All
really
right.
enjoyed it. All the best to you now. All the best.
You too.